Tendai Mwadi, kings and queens. Tendai Mwadi. Garvey lives, Mosiah lives. Welcome to the first in our series of Mosiah Sessions 2020. We want to welcome you as the Alkebu-Lan Revivalist Movement, kings and queens. My name is Shakara, Tafazwa Shakara Bandaka in full, and Shakara for short, kings and queens. I am a born and raised member of the Alkebu-Lan Revivalist Movement, and so we've started by bringing you greetings in the most precious, powerful, and bountiful name of Alkebu-Lan, Mama Africa, in the spirits of our most gracious ancestors, and in a prayer for oneness, hope, and prosperity for all African people on the face of Mother Earth. We bring you greetings on behalf of Brother Leader Mbandaka and the entire leadership of the Alkebu-Lan Revivalist Movement, who initiated this month called Mosiah, kings and queens, in the year 1998. That is 22 years ago, kings and queens, and we are full of the joys of the legacy of the most eminent prophet and king, His Excellency Marcus Mosiah Garvey, during this month, as we rededicate ourselves to fulfilling the mission of our great ancestors and the vision that they set before us, kings and queens. We want to give thanks to all our ancestors. This is the fourth of Mosiah, and we have a very, very important conversation and presentation to be delivered to you today, kings and queens, by a great and illustrious scholar activist in our community, a man by the name of Ifayomi Grant. Yes, indeed, kings and queens, the subject today is African PowerNomics and the Garvey Movement, kings and queens. African PowerNomics and the Garvey Movement. Before we get into the subject, though, we must movement, kings and queens. Excuse me. Before we get into the subject, we have to just deal with our preliminary rituals. And throughout the month of Mosiah, kings and queens, throughout the month of Mosiah, we partake in what we call the Mosiah Daily Affirmations, which is housed in this book with word sounds of the prophet, accompanied by commentaries from Brother Leader Mbandaka to bring it up to date, kings and queens. And you know, rituals are very important to a sovereign people. And so one of the rituals that we engage in during Mosiah is that every day we go to our shrines and we read the affirmation of the day, 31 affirmations for the 31 days of Mosiah, and we meditate, and conversate on the meaning of the affirmation and its commentary. And so I'm going to engage in that for you right about now, and then we're going to introduce Brother Ifayomi. Affirmation for day 4 is entitled, God Commands Self-Mastery. Man and woman were not made to be creeping, crawling beings. They were made to be captains of their own ship and masters of their own destiny. Therefore, as they select that much out of life, they get and nothing more. Everyone around you has selected their particular place in the world and shall rise no higher than their selection. Be the man or woman God Almighty wanted you to be, and not the creeping, crawling creature that most of us have become. Such is the wisdom of the most eminent prophet and king, His Excellency Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Hail to the power of the word. Hail to the power of the word. Hail to the power of the word. And to complete our affirmation, I'm going to read from the commentary now, as written by Brother Leader Bandaka. It reads, self-mastery is the best testimony to the existence of Mwadi, the creator, in us. The capacity to realize our divine purpose and potential, and to control our own destiny in life. When we surrender this, we surrender our faith in Mwadi and defy Mwadi's will. We then become the glorified or vilified slaves of others whose will are not congruent with Mwadi's will. Let us stand tall and move stridently towards this goal, to reclaim mastery over our own destiny, to be the preservers of our own past, the controllers of our present, and the shapers of our own future. This is self-mastery and the pathway to our divine destiny. Such is the wisdom of our spiritual leader, Robert Leader Bandaka. Hail to the power of the word, hail to the power of the word, and hail to the power of the word. Yes, indeed, kings and queens. True says lockdown. That don't mean so we pop down. Mosiah must go on always and forever and forever, kings and queens. And even within the midst of the lockdown, you know, it has presented us with opportunities, and one of them is the fact that we are able to have cast our net wider in terms of the people that we bring to the Mosiah sessions. So we're going to be, you know, inter and outer national throughout the month of Mosiah in a way that we may not have been had you know, things been as normal, kings and queens. And this man who we're going to bring to you today has been on the list for a Mosiah session for years, years in the making. And it's a powerful thing that we're able to bring him this year, because this year we are celebrating the 100th year anniversary of the International Convention of the Negro Peoples of the World. The flag, the red, black, and green flag that you see mounted on the wall behind me, was given to us and designated the flag of the African nation in 1920 at that monumental event at which 25,000 people came to Madison Square Garden in New York City to chart a course for African liberation and African redemption. They elected a government in exile and declared the colonial governments on the continent and throughout the Caribbean to be illegitimate. And so they elected a government in exile for the purpose of liberating Africa and freeing it from colonization. And our ancestors also wrote the Declaration of Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World and declared, the rights that we are demanding and the respect that we are demanding from the rest of the world as a result, kings and queens. And so point number 39 within the Declaration of Rights says that the red, black, and green shall be the colors of the African nation. And so we are celebrating 100 years since that monumental event and since this flag was chosen by the African people of the world. And so there's more to be said on that. But it is just an honor to have our brother Ifayomi Grant join us in this year, kings and queens. The economic program of the UNIA ACO is one of the most celebrated, yet one of the most understudied aspects of the Garvey legacy. And because of that, we often stand in some levels of confusion regarding what is the right economic philosophy and practice to take us forward in the 21st century and beyond. And there's been a lot of confusion because many of us have been indoctrinated into this thinking that Marcus Garvey was a capitalist. Yes. And most of the people that say this have not done any sufficient study on the economic program of the UNIA and how we can update it and implement it in today's world, kings and queens. So I do want to send a special shout out to Sister Natasha Lewis. By the way, for those who are watching, feel free to use the chat on the right hand side of the screen, and we will, take your questions there as well. And later on, there'll be a Q&A where you will be able to come on the panel and ask Brother Ifayomi a question. Right, I'm going to bring forward Brother Ifayomi to you right now, kings and queens, the illustrious, the powerful, the erudite, the handsome, the good-looking Brother Ifayomi Grant, kings and queens. Greetings, Brother Ifayomi.
Oh, greetings, Brother Shakara. That was money well spent given to you to give me those compliments.
I agree, Roy, and I agree. I did forget to send the bank details, so I'll send it to you after the presentation. It's all good.
Okay, not a problem.
Yes,
well, first of all, greetings to you and greetings to the Alkebu-Lan Revivalist Movement. Definite thanks for having me on the Mosiah month schedule and calendar. I know it's a highlight of the year in terms of the activities that you do, although you do many throughout the year. So
yes,
I'm honored to be invited on by you. And I suppose I'd start by saying that I recognize how much ARM has done to actually give the Honourable Marcus Mosiah Garvey the profile that he deserves, or to work towards giving him the profile he deserves, because there's been a concerted effort to write him out of our history deliberately, so because of the lessons that he could teach us. And to me, when you look at the what they call the 20th century according to the Gregorian calendar, to me he's without doubt the outstanding African leader, visionary of that century and probably of most centuries. So the fact that ARM has done so much to raise him up and to bring him to our attention, I think is really positive. So I also give the presentation with some caution and some humility, because I know that ARM members will know the history of the UNIA inside out, and with more detail than myself. And I don't claim to be a Professor Tony Martin, who was probably the preeminent Garvey scholar. And obviously I do give due deference to his work here, which has informed some of what I do. But what I try to do is really to encapsulate some of the key history from the movement, but also then to take us forward to think about what do we need to learn from that. And I think that's the key thing, is that we don't put our leaders in a glass case and just admire them. We have to take that work and bring it forward for the environment that we're in today, and see what the lessons we can apply, because the world changes, and so we need to adapt and change to our environment.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, we're all still learning, my brother. And I will say this from the Alkebu-Lan revivalist movement's perspective: there are a few people that we would consider more qualified to deliver a presentation such as this. Yeah. In this respect, and I mean in our world global African community, because it's not just about knowing the history, but being able to, as you're saying, take those lessons and apply them in ways that are very practical, in ways that are very well thought out in their theory. And you are one such brother, my brother. So we humble ourselves to you and your scholarship and your work over the years. And we've learnt much from it, my brother. And so, yeah, I feel like it's time to get into it. You ready, bro?
Yeah, definitely. And one thing I would say, if people are for the people watching live and also people who watch it recorded, I always say anything you see, use your intelligence and view it with a critical eye. So use your own intelligence to judge what's said. Don't just take what I say for granted. There's a slide with a whole lot of references towards the end, and you know, there's also my email address will come up later on. So if people want to email me, they can get the presentation. I've already sent it to yourself as well, so you can send it out to people. But I always encourage people, use your own intelligence to think about what's being said, and what makes sense, apply it. What doesn't make sense, discard it. So I always say that before I present. So without further ado, we can get on into it.
All right, we're going to set this up now, kings and queens. While I was with this brother Ifayomi just setting up the presentation, I want to remind you that if you should be watching on YouTube. Some of you are watching on the Alkebu-Lan website, alkebu-lan.org, which is fine. But if you would like to be interactive and comment in the chat section, feel free to come over to click the video and open up the YouTube window, so you can come and interact with other brothers and sisters who are watching, and you'll be able to conversate as well as ask questions. So not everybody may want to come live with us and ask a question later on, but you may want to type the question in the chat, so feel free to do so. Brother Ifayomi, that little hide button, you can hit that if you want to remove that little section at the bottom of the screen.
Okay.
There. Yeah, so just hit that, make sure that's because sometimes it closes down your presentation. All right, cool. All right, bro, I'm going to leave you to it, and I'll be back when you're finished.
All right, then. Thank you very much, Tendamwari. Okay, so greetings. So the topic for today is African PowerNomics and the Garvey Movement. And as I said, what I'm going to do, I will take a bit of time to actually talk about the birth and the growth, the development, and then the ultimate demise of the Garvey movement in terms of its the heights it reached. Obviously, UNIA continued after the death of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, but I want to focus on the period when obviously it was most active and see what lessons we can learn from that. So what we're going to cover in today's presentation is the background to the Garvey movement, its growth, which was phenomenal, the ideology that underpinned it. We'll look at the aims and objectives, organizations within the UNIA, because there was structures, and I think that's one of the things I want to emphasize, that they had detailed rules and procedures and structures within the UNIA. The self-funding nature of it, which is another thing I'm always keen to emphasize, the fact that we need to put our money where our mouth is, and we need to invest in the things we say we believe in. And I firmly believe if you look at the things that somebody spends their money on, you can see what they really believe in. Then we'll look at the reasons for the decline of the UNIA. Then we'll go on to look at a book called Tribes, which some of you may have heard of, many of you may not, by Joel Kotkin. And we'll talk about what's required to create a global economic nation. We'll briefly touch on the work of Claude Anderson, Dr. Claude Anderson, who's the author of the book PowerNomics, especially as we've got PowerNomics in the title of this presentation. And he has some ideas of what makes a community. And then we'll finish up with 2 slides of lessons we can learn from the Garvey movement, economic lessons in particular, and then just my concept of the 5 legs of the economic stool. So 5 things that individuals, communities and nations need to address in terms of trying to build economic strength and viability. Okay, so Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, people often forget the ACL part of it, was founded 15th of July 1914 in Jamaica by the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And as many of you will know, Marcus Garvey immigrated to Harlem, New York, and he set up the first branch of the UNIA and the headquarters in Liberty Hall. So from the first branch in Harlem, over 1,000 branches of UNIA were established throughout the USA, Central and South America, the West Indies and Africa. Now, I think, that's what's quite remarkable when you think of the time that Marcus Garvey was living in, how rapidly the UNIA grew, and also the internationalization of it. And I think that's an important lesson for us to learn, because we live in a time now where there are many commentators who are seeking to either deliberately or inadvertently divide up the African family into different slices and pit one of us against the other. And Marcus Garvey always had a global vision for Africans, or as he said, the 400 million Negroes of the world. And I think that's something that we need to remember was key to the success of what he did. So in terms of growth, the UNIA can definitely, and ACL can definitely be used as a model for social and economic development for our people. By 1919, the UNIA had about 2 million members, and the membership eventually grew to around 6 million members. So if you think from starting in 1914 in Jamaica, 5 years later, 2 million members, that is just unprecedented, I think. Again, especially for a people who, Jamaica was colonized, the whole of Africa, with bar a few nations, were colonized. Africans in the United States were essentially living under a form of colonization, which they still suffer under. So to achieve this kind of growth was absolutely amazing. But I think it also, to some degree, shows that the more overt oppression is, the more it increases people's appetite for liberation. And to some degree, the more softer oppression we have in places like Britain and the USA compared to perhaps 100 years ago, as perhaps dulls some of our senses. Okay, so in terms of ideology, Garveyism contended that the black people of the world had only progressed from chattel slavery to economic slavery because they had no economic base of power. So Garvey was always really interested in economics, and he saw that economics was the key to liberation. And I think that's one of my bugbears and concerns in what we might say the cultural nationalist movement, is that it's not an either or, and I think that's a problem. Sometimes we engage in what I call dichotomous thinking, that we think problems are either or problems. So we either focus on sort of cultural nationalism or sort of economic nationalism, economic development, when in fact we just need to do both. So there's nothing wrong with the cultural aspects of the kind of epiphany that Africans have had in terms of reclaiming their African identity. But that must be combined with what Mutabaruka calls belly politics. That is, we need to deal with issues about food, clothing and shelter, the basic economic issues that people face. If somebody's hungry, there's no point giving them a book of philosophy. You need to give them food first. So Marcus Garvey understood that, and he always had economics at the center of what he was trying to do, as well as the other symbolic and social and cultural aspects of the organization. Explicit in the philosophy was that black people were not to blame God, but rather man's inhumanity to man for their oppressed plight. So according to some writers, Crawford, for example, Garveyism stressed the need for blacks, those of Negro blood and race, as Garvey put it, to organize and work together as a group and not to depend on any other group but Negroes. So the whole self-empowerment, we see this idea very prominent in our history. And Marcus Garvey was saying all the things that we probably still say today 100 years ago. And there was no internet and there was no ease of mass communication for Africans. So two slogans of the UNIA encapsulate Garveyism: Africa for Africans, and the UNIA motto, one aim, one God, one destiny. And the UNIA philosophy emphasized the fact that no matter where a black person was living, they were still African. So the aims and objectives. So the UNIA was a very organized organization. They had clear rules. They had a constitution, book of laws made for the UNIA and the African Communities League. And it was made effective on July 1918. It was amended again in 1920 and 1921. So I've just taken out of the Article 1 of the Constitution the objectives and aims of the UNIA and ACL, and there were 10 objectives which are listed. You can see I've put the ones that are in bold either have an explicitly economic dimension, or they can only really be fulfilled with an economic base. So you can read most of them together, and you can see they encompass cultural nationalism, but 4 is to administer to and assist the needy. So that's kind of social welfare, but obviously to provide social welfare, you need some economic means. 6 is to assist in the development of independent Negro nations and communities. And again, that can only happen with an economic base. Otherwise, you're stuck in what many African countries are today, which is neo-colonialism and simply flag independence. Number 9 is the most explicitly economic, to conduct a worldwide commercial and industrial intercourse for the good of the people. We'll touch about what that, how they manifested that a bit later on. And 10, to work to better conditions in all Negro communities. So it's very much a global vision and very much encompassed all aspects of life, you know, to promote the spirit of pride and love, etc., reclaim the fallen. So it was very holistic. So organizations within the UNIA. So there were at least 3, there may have been more, but at least 3 organizations within the UNIA. There was the Universal African Legions, Universal African Black Cross Nurses, and the Universal African Motor Corps. So in terms of the African Legion, membership was open to active members between the age of 18 to 55 years of age who are in good health. And the purpose was to teach these men military skills and discipline. So again, this is another aspect of nation building. The Legion was under the direct supervision of the Minister of the Legions. In most of the books, it refers to it as the Sphinx, but I think Haramaket, the African name, was better. So the Haramaket was a symbol of the Legion. The Legion was a uniformed army with a military chain of command and stratification. So in a way, building the kind of the army before the nation has been formed. The purpose of the Legion was to provide protection for the UNIA. So I suppose the way you could think of it, like the fruit of Islam, perhaps, and the black community against racist and unjust physical aggression. And I think if we just look at the United States today, we could see the definite need for something like the Universal African Legion. The Universal African Motor Corps was open to active members aged between 15 and 45 and was to assist the Legion in the performance of their duties. So almost like a sort of apprenticeship, bringing in young people and introducing them into the Motor Corps before they became full members of the Universal African Legions. And then we had the Universal African Black Cross Nurses, were to carry on a system of relief and to assist in mitigating the suffering caused by pestilence, famine, fire, floods, and other great calamities. They were to care for the sick and engage in preventative medicine. And they issued pamphlets on safety and accident prevention. They instructed the public in sanitation and first aid. The organization was open to active female members aged 16 to 45. So again, addressing one of the core needs, which is health. So you can see that essentially the UNIA and ACL were building all the aspects of a nation almost in exile. And obviously part of the program was to for people to move to Africa, but also to build strength where you were. And I think that's one of the important things, is that you don't just, even if your goal is repatriation, the liberation of the continent, they weren't waiting for that to happen first. They were building on the ground they were based on. I think that's what we all need to do and take from Marcus Mosiah Garvey's lessons. So self-funding. I've put Ujamaa and Kujichagulia, but obviously, which are principles in Nguzo Saba, but there's other principles as well, which unity and other principles, which the idea of self-funding also touches on. But I just picked on those two. Ujamaa is cooperative economics, Kujichagulia is self-determination. So according to Article 9 of the Constitution, all persons of Negro blood and African ancestry are regarded as ordinary members and entitled to consideration of the UNIA. So just by being born an African, you're regarded as an ordinary member. They also had active members, though, and active members were defined as those who pay dues and they have first claim to considerations of the UNIA. So considerations included assistance in illness and financial depression. So in a way, you're building a sort of social network safety net. You know, in a country like the United States, where there was very little social welfare safety net, even today, you know, we see the absence of the type of universal health care that we have in, say, the United Kingdom and most rich countries. In the United States, healthcare is linked to, for many people, is linked to your job. You lose your job, you often lose your healthcare. So the UNIA, Marcus Mosiah Garvey and his organization were building a safety net for people within a country that's, even then, was the most powerful country in the world, even though the British Empire hadn't died as yet. And that's really important, this idea of self-funding, investing in ourselves and providing a support and safety net for people when they fall in hard times. So in terms of contributions, each active member was assessed 25 cents per month, $1 each January, a 10-cent death tax per month, a 5-cent tax to help pay a $75 death benefit to the deceased person's family. In addition, each active member was required to pay $5 annually into the African Redemption Fund. So within there, you've almost got your kind of funeral insurance plan. You know, you've got death tax money, so you've got that already being built in to assist the family. And then you've got the wider African Redemption Fund. So you can see you're building in things for the individual as well as for the wider group. And you're creating, like all insurance policies, the wider pool you take, you insure risks across the group. So people who may be sickly can still benefit from it, and because healthy people are paying into the process as well. All high officials, members of the parent body and local officials were required to subscribe to the Black Star Line stock, and we'll touch on the Black Star Line steamship company later on. No specific number of stocks were required to be purchased by the above positions, but they had to buy some stock, and we'll talk about the cost of the stock a bit later as well. In addition to these dues and taxes, members of various organizations within the UNIA were required to pay minimal dues. So one of the issues I've sometimes had, which has, in my view, led to the me exiting some organizations, or organizations coming to an untimely death, has been where I've always suggested and encouraged that when people start organizations, whether their purpose is economic or not, that everybody should contribute to the organization to create a fund, even if they're organizations which seek sort of public funding. They should always have some unrestricted funds which come from the contribution of those who are involved. And there's often a reluctance to do this. I remember an organization where we wanted to set up a credit union, and we said initially we could get 100 people put in £100 each, get £10,000 and get that as a starting point, and then we could follow the process. There's a ABCO, Association of British Credit Unions. They can give you the support, and unsurprisingly, we found that we couldn't get the 100 people, because even some of the core members had long stories about why they didn't think it was the time, and you know, all the blah blah, the usual excuses you have. So I think that's always a critical test in any organization. I don't get involved in any organization where there's not some money that has to be put in by everybody. It can be on a sliding scale depending on means, but people have to invest in the organizations they're involved in. So second part of funding, the UNIA and ACL was a self-supporting organization, with the African Communities League being the arm under which the financial corporations were operated. So they had a legal structure, and again, that's important. The League was designed to establish economic solvency and independence in the African communities of the world. So a major funding aim was to build an economic base for the nation, which the UNIA was attempting to establish. So under the direction of the African Communities League, which was incorporated on the 31st of July 1918 as a business corporation, you had the Negro Factories Corporation was founded, which probably many of you will have heard of. So the Negroes Factories Corporation managed the UNIA's laundries, restaurants, doll factory, tailoring, millinery establishments, and a printing press. Millinery, that's making hats, I believe. And so I've sorted the size, the source for that information there, which was from 1921. And the African Communities League's greatest financial endeavor, which I'll talk on in detail in the next few slides, evolved around the Black Star Line Steamship Corporation, which again I think is the one thing, if people who didn't know much about Marcus Mosiah Garvey and the UNIA ACL, if they say, what one of the things do you know, they might say they've heard about the Black Star Liner and the Black Star Line Steamship Corporation. Okay, so let's look at the Black Star Line Steamship Corporation in more detail, because this was also one of the means that was used to eventually destroy and undermine Marcus Mosiah Garvey. So I've cited some sources there. Obviously, I talked about Professor Tony Martin, who's probably the leading, he's passed away sadly, but he was probably the leading Garvey scholar and academic, and did a lot to bring the greatness of Marcus Mosiah Garvey to a more contemporary African public. So the Black Star Line Steam Corporation was incorporated in Delaware, June the 27th, 1919, with a capital stock of $500,000. So shares had a par value of $5 each, and individuals could purchase a maximum of 200 shares. And I think that's important, because obviously 200 shares, that means $1,000, which means that the maximum the individual could have would be 1/500th or 0.2% of all the shares. So what you could see they were doing there was building in the fact that no one individual or few individuals could control the majority of the stock. So it would then be a genuinely widespread shareholding and democratic enterprise in that sense, in that there will be a large number of shareholders, and a few wealthy people couldn't control the majority of stocks, which is what you often see in large corporations now, where you have very large corporations that actually hold the majority of the stock, and the run-of-the-mill individual who might have a few thousand shares here, etc., has no real say over the running of the company, because the decisions are made based on the percentage of shareholding of the people who are voting, rather than the number of individuals involved. So by having a cap on the number of shares an individual could purchase, you help to mitigate that kind of concern. So the multiple purposes of the line were to eliminate the racial discrimination suffered by black passengers on white liners, and to provide jobs for black seamen. And the two most important needs which the UNIA envisaged the Black Star Line fulfilling were to provide transportation for Negroes to return to Africa, and to act as a means of linking together the black peoples of the world. African and West Indian merchants saw in it the hope of independence from racist white companies. So he was essentially trying to build trade links. At the moment we see that China's got this huge project. I mean, it's a huge, massive endeavor, which is trying to build train lines, infrastructure, roads, right across the whole of Asia into Europe, gas pipelines linking with Turkey and all sorts of companies. And China sees the benefit of building this infrastructure for the transport and movement of goods and services and utilities and gas, all to obviously endeavor to enrich the Chinese economy. And Marcus Mosiah Garvey saw the need to have trade links established between Africa, United States, the Caribbean islands, and his aim obviously was everywhere where African people are. So this was part of the vision that he had in terms of starting this corporation. So within less than 3 months of incorporation, the line had amassed enough money to purchase the Yarmouth on the 17th of September 1919 at a cost of $165,000. So I just went online and used one of these inflation calculators and worked out the current value of that, which would be just over $2.5 million in today's money. So, I mean, if you think about it, we're talking 1919. Marcus Mosiah Garvey didn't get to the US till about 1915. So in 4 years, he's already built an organization where they can raise $2.5 million to buy the first liner. So again, that just emphasizes the the belief that people had in what the UNIA was doing, the ability to actually get Africans, and of course many of the members weren't rich people at all, to put their money where their mouth is and to invest in these endeavors. So the Yarmouth, which was unofficially named the Frederick Douglass, after the great fighter for emancipation, sailed 3 voyages between New York, Cuba, Panama, the West Indies, and Costa Rica, transporting hundreds of passengers and shiploads of cargo. So eventually a total of 3 more ships were purchased by the Black Star Line. And again, I think that's really impressive as well. But due to combination of poor management, lack of fiscal planning, graft, which is essentially people who are within the organization who were stealing from the organization, and sabotage at the hand of white crew members, because they had to employ some white crew members because they couldn't necessarily find Africans who had all the skills because of restrictions of being placed on Africans being able to attain those positions. The venture fell into bankruptcy, and then this started to sow the seeds for the later decline. So I said, ironically, although this was the largest and initially it was the most successful venture in the UNIA, and it had the potential to be a key mechanism in building a worldwide black nation, how it was a key in the demise of the UNIA, because what the United States government did was they convicted Marcus Garvey of selling the line stock through the mail. And so he was convicted of mail fraud. And through this mechanism, they were able to incarcerate him and then deport him back to Jamaica. So there were, as I'll talk about in the next few slides, there were traitors within and there were enemies without who worked assiduously to destroy the UNIA. So what are the reasons for the decline of the UNIA? So Professor Tony Martin, he identified what he believed to be key factors in the decline of the UNIA. And these, it's not exhaustive, but these are some of the things he's listed, which were the economic depression of the 1930s. So we had our own Great Recession, which began in around 2007, 2008. And prior to that, the most famous sort of economic downturn was the Great Depression, which started in around 1929 and really didn't end. If you talk about the United States, although there was some lulls within it, it didn't really end until actually the United States entered the Second European World War in 1941, where the uptake in the transformation of industrial production to military production put loads of people back to work, and that finally kind of ended the recession in the US. But there was that huge depression, which obviously would have had a disproportionate impact on Africans, particularly as although many of the social welfare programs which President Roosevelt introduced were helpful, Africans were excluded from some of these benefits that were provided. So we suffered as usual more than anybody went during the Great Depression of the 1930s, and so that undermined some of the financial support from the organization's membership, because obviously many people had lost their jobs and were literally just trying to survive. Martin tells us that Garvey being deported left the organization without its charismatic leadership. And you can imagine that somebody who had the ability to build such a huge organization in such a short space of time would inevitably have been like the shining beacon that people were looking to. So in a way, it's cutting off the head and the body will fall. And I suppose there's a lesson there for us in the sense of we need to build layers of leadership and management and structures that enable us to make our leadership of an organization less vulnerable to attack, and also that if you lose a leader, no matter how great they are, that they can be replaced. And that comes onto the idea of institutionalization, which I might talk about a bit later on if there's time. So, but I did note that even in Garvey's absence, there was sufficient economic support and membership participation to hold the 8th International Convention in Toronto, Canada in August of 1938. So the organization was still moving forward and still pushing on, even despite the removal of its leader. Increasingly, financial troubles plagued the UNIA, and after the Black Star Line Steam Corporation was forced to close its business doors, that just was exacerbated those difficulties. Membership also was eroded due to fragmentation of the UNI members. So people began to splinter into different organizations, such as I listed a few here: the Peace Movement of Ethiopia, also inroads by Father Divine, who was a famous charismatic leader around the time, the Black Muslims, the Moorish Americans, also contributed to its decline in membership. So there's a whole range of organizations. Obviously, the Nation of Islam grew up out of the UNIA because it said, and I've no reason to doubt it, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was a member of the UNIA and learned many of the things about organizing and building from that time. But there was lots of different organizations that kind of splintered and grew out of the UNIA as it was declining. However, the most important thing which I want to emphasize is that the US government was probably the most important factor in the decline of the UNIA. So Professor Martin, he links J. Edgar Hoover, who's probably the most famous head of the FBI, even to this day. And there was a conspiracy to spy on the UNIA and to jail Marcus Garvey for mail fraud, as I mentioned earlier. And Professor Martin also connects Tyler. There's an individual called Tyler who was slated to try to assassinate Marcus Garvey, and that person has been linked with the US government. And there's also an individual called James E. Amos, who's an ex-bodyguard of former President Theodore Roosevelt, and at the time a black agent of the FBI, and he was given the task of spying on the UNIA. I believe he was the first black FBI agent and recruited specifically to infiltrate and to spy on the UNIA. And this kind of brings to mind the tactics and strategy which J. Edgar Hoover brought to bear under COINTELPRO, which stands for Counterintelligence Program, which they launched against the Black Liberation Movement in the 1960s, against the Black Panthers. Obviously, there was murders of people like Fred Hampton. So this was simply a kind of replaying in the 60s of what they'd been doing to the UNIA earlier on. Okay, so I've given you a kind of overview of as briefly as I can, and I would emphasize that obviously you really need to read the philosophies and opinions of Marcus Garvey. You need to read the books of Professor Tony Martin to really get a full sense. I've just tried to give you an overview of what the organization was like and give you a sense of its scale, its amazing, phenomenal growth and achievements. But now I want to kind of try to move it forward and talk about what are some of the lessons that we can learn, because I think that we have to really bear in mind that given the context in which Marcus Mosiah Garvey was operating in the UNIA in the United States in the early part of the 20th century, just the outright brazen, naked, oppressive racism, the fact that African people were living under colonization almost everywhere in the world, it was almost destined to be undermined just simply because there was almost no safe haven anywhere in the world for Africans, and the power of European forces was so overwhelming at that time. So no matter what he had done, they would probably have found some charge to lay against him. And of course, with infiltrators and other people such as that, it was always going to be an incredibly difficult task to bring his vision to fruition. But in a way, the vision is the legacy, and the lessons are for us to pick up and run with. So over the years, I've read many books about what are the keys to economic success, and I always take them with a pinch of salt, but also take the sense that's from within them and the things that we can learn from. And one such book is Tribes: How Race, Religion, and Identity Determine Success in the New Global Economy, written by a man called Joel Kotkin. And essentially, he identifies what he calls 5 global tribes, and then he tries to pick out common characteristics that he thinks are synonymous with their economic success. It doesn't put criminality amongst any of the characteristics, but the ones the tribes he identifies are the British, the Chinese, the Indians, the Jews, and the Japanese. And he identifies the following characteristics He says that each global tribes shares quintessential, which just kind of means typical of that quality, quintessential characteristics that will determine success in the economy of the 21st century. So he was looking forward from the late 1990s into what he thought would be essential in the 21st century. And these three key things, he says, are a strong ethnic identity with a sense of mutual dependence and emphasis on the family structure. The second is a global network based on tribal trust that allows the group to function collectively. I'm not really sure how much trust there is amongst the so-called British. They had to have contract law because of a lack of trust. But anyway, that's what he says. And the third one, a passion for technology and a belief in scientific progress. So those are characteristics that he's identified. And it's interesting because in the book, the only African leader he mentions is Marcus Mosiah Garvey. So I think it's around page 250 to 251. He has a section talking about Marcus Mosiah Garvey. So I've just taken some excerpts from it, because if we just go back and think about those characteristics, a strong ethnic identity, well, obviously Marcus Mosiah Garvey was emphasizing his work was for Africans and that we should all identify as African. A global network, that's what Marcus Mosiah Garvey was building. It wasn't just about the United States. It wasn't just about North America. It was about the whole African world. And a passion for technology and a belief in scientific progress. Marcus Mosiah Garvey was always emphasizing the need to adapt and adopt technology, and that we needed to be as au fait with science and technology as any other people on earth. So what he says about Garvey is, in the early 1920s, Marcus Garvey boldly challenged the black masses to embrace their African roots. In contrast to those who preach accommodation with white society, he encouraged them to resist white culture and economic dominance. Garvey envisaged black Americans part of a global diaspora with ties not only to Africa, but to other areas settled by blacks. This transnational identity would provide what he calls the vocation of uniqueness most evident to him in the Jews. Remember always, he wrote, that the Jew in his political and economic urge is always first a Jew. And then Kotkin goes on to note that Garvey concentrated on developing black economic power through a network of factories, laundries, restaurants, and printing presses. In this respect, Garvey, like his predecessor and early hero, Booker T. Washington, saw the acquisition of critical scientific, technological, and commercial skills as a precondition for true liberation. So yes, Booker T. Washington, although people have various criticisms of him, they say he's an accommodationist, etc., but one of the things he always emphasized was trades, technological education, scientific education, and that we must be able to do practical things. We have to be a productive people. Okay, so Dr. Claude Anderson, this presentation says PowerNomics, and he's the author of the book PowerNomics, a national plan to empower Black America. And we often talk about this word community, and we've heard Kotkin talking about strong ethnic identity. So Dr. Anderson identified 4 characteristics of communities in contrast to what he calls neighborhoods. So essentially differentiates between a neighborhood where you simply have people who look like each other or share some common characteristics living in proximity, as opposed to a community. And he says the community has the following 4 characteristics. First, a shared sense of identity, which is actually the first thing that Kotkin said, which leads to the creation of 2, which is trust, which facilitates 3, which is cooperation, which is supported by the presence of 4, which is accountability, which is that people are held responsible for their actions. So those are and I suppose you can think about maybe the place you live or the country you live if you're from overseas, and say, do I actually live in a true African community? And probably most of us have to say a resounding no, I'd guess. Okay, so the final, I think it's about 10 minutes to go. We'll look at the lessons we can learn from the Garvey movement's rise and decline. So these are my personal ideas and lessons which I think we need to really have embedded in our minds. Cut off the head and the body will fall, which I spoke about earlier on. So the importance of dispersed leadership and institutionalization. all I mean by institutionalization is that there's a difference between a group and an institution. So a group is normally dependent on one or two individuals. You remove those two individuals and the organization or the group just falls away. An institution is dependent on its rules, procedures, ethos, culture, processes. And if you take out the leader, there's somebody who slots straight into. If you take out the next person, there's somebody who slots in. They've got channels for talent development, channels for leadership development, and they have clear roles and responsibilities, so that it takes an awful lot to undermine the function of an institution as opposed to a group or an organization. The importance of self-funding, which I spoke about earlier on, the importance of developing productive capacity, i.e. the ability to actually make things. So the rudiments, as I said, you know, food, clothing, shelter. If you think about the things we've got at the moment, can we make our own socks? Can we make our own underwear? Can we make our own trousers? Can we make our own shirts? I mean, any nation beginning to develop, the first thing they normally start is building a textile industry. That's one of the lower rungs of industrial development, industrialization. You look at China when they first started, they used to be known for sort of cheap and nasty goods, and look what they've got now. Similarly, Japan used to be a joke in terms of made in Japan used to mean low quality, and people used to turn their nose up at it. But within 15, 20 years, the Japanese transformed their productive capacity and the ability to produce quality goods. So you need to start at the lower rungs of production, which is often textiles industry, and then you build increasing sophistication and complexity into your productive capacity. The importance of cultural identity as a foundation for organization and nation building. Garvey understood that. The book of the tribes I mentioned shows you how your economic ideology should flow from your culture, not the other way around, because it should reflect your values and it should also reflect how you operate as a people. And so that's one of the tasks we need to do, which is to build an economic paradigm out of our African culture, which don't mean we put our culture in say it has to be the culture of 4,000 years ago. It's about what are our core values, core beliefs, and then we build an economic paradigm out of that. It doesn't mean we don't learn from other people. That would be silly, because any sensible people learn from other sources, but you see things through your own lens and you adapt it to, if it's useful, to make sure that it fits your needs. Economic ideological pragmatism. So Brother Shakara talked about, was Marcus Garvey a capitalist? Well, was he a socialist? So actually, I think he was an economic pragmatist. He understood that he was in the United States, which is a very capitalist country. So he needed to make his organization work within that context. Some of the things he did could be seen as not really capitalist in the sense of owning the means of production, although he was focused on that. Many of them could be seen as socialist. So the social welfare aspect of it, you might see it as socialist, as akin to the welfare state. The businesses you could see as capitalist in terms of trying to make a profit. I think he was an economic pragmatist. And if you look at most countries in the world, they have elements of what people regard as capitalism. So, private companies that make money for their shareholders. And equally, they have elements of things which we consider to be socialist. So, for example, the National Health Service of Britain, there's not much more socialist than something like that, where everybody pays in through their taxes and everybody gets their healthcare free at the point of delivery. So all those kind of, so I think it's silly to try and paint him into a box that his behavior didn't show that he wanted to be in. He was about solving problems, and he understood that you don't necessarily have to be rigid. You have to apply yourself to the environment which you live in. So, for example, even if you're a socialist, it's silly to say that all the jeans in the country should be made by one company. Jeans are not an essential service, so there's no problem with having 10 companies making jeans, and people can choose who they want to buy their jeans from. On the other hand, you might say that something like water is an essential service that should be controlled by the state to ensure that people always have access to water. So to me, Marcus Garvey was an economic pragmatist. And in general, what he preached was internal cooperation. So he preached cooperation between and amongst African people, and external competitiveness, that we needed to be able to, I see there's a typo there, sorry about that. We needed to be able to compete with other groups of people, other races, other ethnicities in the wider world marketplace. other lessons we can learn. The UNIA offers a model for adolescent development. I think this is something that when we think about rites of passage, although they didn't necessarily call it that, the structures they had were a form of rites of passage. So as I said earlier, male adolescents became members of the Universal African Legion, where they were taught moral development and self-discipline by the older men in the organization, who acted as role models, or Jegna, which you might be familiar with the term mentors, but there's also the term Jegna. They were apprenticed to the various businesses owned and operated by the UNIA to learn a skill for self-sufficiency. So this was, again, apprenticeship as a part of your rites of passage. Additionally, the young men were taught African history in order to instill racial pride and dignity. And the same process held true for young women who participate in the Black Cross nurses. So they were, when we think about issues that we have with young people who don't have employment, don't have work, Mosiah Garvey saw that issue, and that we needed to have institutions, organizations that could bring young people in and give them useful, productive things to do, and through that process of productivity also inculcate our values within those young people. Right, so near the end now. So the issues for individuals, communities, and nations. So what are some of the key issues, not only from Mosiah Garvey, but generally, I think we need a simple way of thinking about the things we need to do individually as communities and nations. So I have this idea of the five legs of the economic stool. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to put the actual picture into presentation because my house is upside down at the moment and I couldn't find the relevant slide anywhere. But the five legs of the stool are debt. So whether it's as a nation or whether it's an individual or communities, we need to eliminate bad debt. And basically, bad debt is debt that's not taken out for any productive purpose, or is not likely to lead to any source of income or accumulation of capital. So, for example, you can think bad debt is buying a flashy car that's going to depreciate in value and doesn't actually bring you any income from owning it. Good debt would be to actually acquire some form of asset that, or for example, debt to start a business where it's actually going to bring you future income and wealth. Consumption is the second leg. And within that, we've heard of lots of Black Mondays, Black Tuesdays, Black Month, Buy Black campaigns, really about supporting homegrown products and services. And this also applies to nations. Most African nations, the consumption is being spent on goods produced from outside of those nations, which only helps to increase a balance of payments deficit. So consumption is something we need to think about at the micro and macroeconomic level. Savings, which obviously is just the accumulation of money. Investment, which is about investing, if we're talking about on a national level, investing in improving domestic productive capacity. One of the key problems for African countries is their inability to turn raw materials into finished products, and that's where all the money is made, all the wealth is created is through transforming, coltan and those other things into components that go into mobile phones. So that's a key issue, but also you need to have investment in order to improve and develop your productive capacity. And then finally, production. And that's again, both at the individual, community, and national level, to be able to create businesses that produce the products, services that we need. And then there's a whole page of references, which, as I said, my email address is here, ifayomi@uwclub.net. So I've also sent the presentation to Brother Shakara, so you can email myself or Brother Shakara, and happy to send you the presentation. You can use it for whatever means you wish to, as long as you just give me credit for having prepared it. So that concludes the presentation. Are you there, Brother Shakara?
I most certainly am, my brother. Give thanks for that presentation right there. I was a little bit like when you said you're nearly finished here, and I'm remembering the time frame that I gave you, and that was with the understanding that we were going to have 2 speakers today, so I should have given you more time. So I apologize for that oversight right there. But
I have a stopwatch on my phone. So.
Yeah, so I apologize for that, because I should have really given you more time, because I know there's more you could have gone into. and I'm saying that, but knowing that you run courses on economics and these kinds of things, and organizations and economic development. But not to worry, our gathering, yeah, is blessed to have more time to interact with you, to ask questions, and to feast from your wellspring of wisdom, my brother. So give thanks for that. And with that, I'm going to be sharing the link now in the chat for my African brothers and sisters who want to come through and ask a question, add to the information, share a perspective, or even challenge something that you've heard. So I'm going to share the link right now in the chat for this video, Kings and Queens. So check that out. And you can come live with Brother Ifayomi now. I will say that this platform that we're using works best with Chrome and Firefox. Yeah, so we advise that you open up the link on one of those two browsers, although they are getting better with the other ones as well, Kings and Queens. So we give thanks. Right. That's interesting. So, Brother Ifayomi, I'm gonna start by asking you a couple questions. In fact, before I do that, I want to read something here from Race First, yeah, just to put some perspective on the earlier part of your presentation. This is one of the books that Brother Ifayomi was mentioning, and if you're gonna get one book on Papa Garvey and the UNIA ACL, it's this book, yeah. And so in the chapter entitled Race First and Self-Reliance, yeah, page 35, he says. He's giving an overview. In fact, let me actually read the chapter, sorry, the paragraph before. Yeah. Right. So he's giving an overview of the Negro Factories Corporation. Yeah, and he says the corporation. So he's gone through the restaurants and so on, and many different things. He said the corporation's beehive printing plant was at 2305 7th Avenue, was described as doing the bulk of Harlem's job and magazine printing. Yeah, so not only was the UNIA ACL printing its own newspapers, but it was doing printing for all the other, yeah, the majority of the printing for other people within Harlem during this time. This is the 1920s. At 62 West 142 Street was situated the corporation's Universal Mart of Industry, which housed a variety of enterprises. These included the Universal Steam and Electric Laundry, which employed 2 delivery trucks, the men's manufacturing department, which made UNIA uniforms, insignia, and the like, and a women's manufacturing department and bazaar, which made Black Cross nurses' uniforms, Panama hats, and other millinery shirts and ties. Panama hats and other millinery shirts and ties. Plans were afoot for a universal catalog and mail order business, and indeed, nurses' uniforms were already available on a mail order basis. And this is what I was going to read initially. Yeah, presiding over the Negro Factories Corporation at that time, employing about 75 people, was Ulysses S. Poston, UNIA Minister of Industries and a former editor of the Black Detroit Contender. Because of his position, Poston found himself called upon to act as an unofficial advisor to Harlem businesses in general. During May 1922 alone, he reported that the UNIA Department of Labor and Industries had received at least 40 visits from Harlem businessmen who wanted the UNIA to bail them out. Yeah, the reason why I've read that, Brother Ifayomi, is because it would seem to me there's been a total reversal in terms of perceptions of Black Pan-African organizations, in the sense of the fact that nowadays I doubt anybody would come to us for business advice and bailouts. in that sense, you know what I'm saying? At that time, the UNIA ACO was perceived to be the place that you go if you need business advice and assistance. You know, and so I think that's a good context for entering our conversation at this time. Now, sorry, go ahead, bro. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say something in response to that. I mean, I think it's Professor Manuel Ampim. He's written a book about how, talking about what he calls how the lecture model became the dominant mode of communication within sort of Pan-Africanist circles, which really became revolved around people giving presentations like this, but then the failure to then actually go forward and actually take the ideas and build and actually invest and develop and actually take those ideas and actually practically, some people say where the rubber meets the road, practical Pan-Africanism. And I think that's what Marcus Mosiah Garvey was about, practical Pan-Africanism. You know, he understood the belly politics, deal with that, and then you can, you know, if you get a hungry man and you give him a bowl of porridge or some food, he'll probably listen to anything you've got to say to him if he thinks he can come back tomorrow and get some more food. And then, you know, whereas what we tend to do nowadays is preach them for an hour and they're still hungry.
I take your point, bro. I take your point. I'm going to ask you a question on economic theory, and then we'll get into the practical stuff, the strategic stuff. The first question is, it is my contention that Papa Garvey, in the philosophies and opinions, the message to the people, like political theory, he was strong on. Yeah, it's abundant in political theory and cultural considerations, sometimes religious considerations, but economic theory is not abundant in his writings. I wanted to know from you if that is the reason why this concept of the UNIA, ACR, and Marcus Garvey being a capitalist has been so popular.
I think yes, because if somebody doesn't make a lot of explicit statements on a subject, you can essentially project onto them whatever you wish to project onto them. So essentially, I mean, you can project capitalism, you can project socialism onto Marcus Mosiah Garvey, because he talked about cooperation. Look at the objectives of the organization. Many of them are to do with social welfare. They're to do with cultural development, cultural nationalism, social welfare, helping the needy, but also, you know, you've got the one about trade and economic intercourse with other people. But he didn't explicitly enshrine them with a rigid economic dogma, which I think, I mean, he wasn't thinking probably about what are people going to be saying in 100 years' time in terms of what label are they putting on me. He was thinking about what do I need to do to build this organization. And also you have to think about being in the United States. If you'd said I mean, I don't know if he would ever have described himself as a socialist or not. I mean, I'm always playing, I'm not a socialist. I don't put label of socialist or capitalist on myself because I see them as two rigid European ideological viewpoints, and we need to build our own economic ideology and philosophy. So we need to use ideas that work and that are useful. But if he'd said he was a socialist in the United States, I mean, if you just project forward to the McCarthyite witch hunts and all that, as an immigrant as well, they would have turfed him out of the country so quickly. I mean, the Soviet Union had only just been born, so it wouldn't have been a good idea for him to do that, even if he'd been minded to do that.
All right. So we've got one person in the back end. Brothers and sisters, the link for joining us live on the panel is in the chat here next to the video on YouTube. So feel free to hit that link right now if you want to come through. And you're going to live long, Brother Anika, because I was about to call your name. In my next question, yeah. In fact, maybe I can ask you this, because the question I was going to ask next was actually based upon the presentation that you delivered. Was it last year on the economics of the Garvey movement? And it was I was going to ask Brother Ifayomi, because you had said that when we talk about the decline of the Black Star Line, one of the contexts for it, Brother Ifayomi, that Brother Anika was alluded us to, was the fact that the steamship industry in general in the 1920s was undergoing a decline, if that makes sense. And so it wasn't just the UNIA, I'm saying, in the Black Star Line, it was there was a broader context in terms of steamships at that time, which is probably why a lot of the ships that were brought were in disrepair and kind of things there. So I wanted to know if you had any more information on that dynamic.
Well, I mean, I think one of the most important things as well was that I mentioned some of the white employees, and they deliberately sabotaged the steamship corporation by, in fact, advising on the purchase of ships that weren't fit for purpose. So they were there helping to undermine actively what was going on. So I think, there is the broader context. And like I said, in the 30s, you had the Great Depression, which caused the organization not unnaturally huge problems because the membership was suffering, so the organization was bound to suffer.
All right, one more question. I'm going to bring Brother Anika, and then we'll go to Brother Gordon. I'm of the opinion, bro. This is a purely opinion question. Yeah, that people are overly critical of. Well, I was going to say the UNIA, but people tend to put this on Marcus Mosiah Garvey directly in terms of, obviously we know that according to the records, that what was paid for the ship was however many times in excess of what the ships are actually worth. Yeah. And in my considering the time and the context, I'm of the opinion that people are overly critical of that occurrence, in the sense of the fact that no European was looking to just sell black people ships on that scale. And I see it as just a sacrifice that kind of comes along with the context of that time, remembering that we're dealing with the process of lynching. Like black towns in the 1920s in America were being razed to the ground and firebombed from the air and burnt. Yeah. And so there were certain things that you had to do. Like we do it today. We go to our jobs and we withstand certain, discrimination for the sake of getting the paycheck. Yeah. And so I feel like in that era, the brothers and sisters of the time knew that they were going to face certain discrimination in terms of trying to get what they were trying to get. So do you believe that people are overly critical of how much was spent on the ships then? Is it a just and relevant critique?
Well, like I said, there's different aspects to it. There's what you might call the face value critique, which is, did you overpay for something? And then there's the context maybe of, why do you think you overpaid for something? So I think the face value critique can be, on the face of it, true, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't understand the context and you don't say, well, actually, if I'd been in that situation with the information available to me, the context, the environment I was working in, that kind of extremely hostile environment, trying to actually do something that was new, within your people, being surrounded by hostile forces. I haven't got Google to go and say, how much should I pay for a ship? Which is what you might do now if you're going to buy a ship. I think people just need to remember the time that they were in. There wasn't any television. There wasn't, there wasn't this kind of mass communication network that we had. It wasn't easy to get access to expertise in everything that you were doing. They were breaking ground and trying to do things new. So they made mistakes, which is inevitable. Yes. You look in today with all the high tech, and look how many mistakes the British government's made in anything you can think about, and then the people are criticizing, a man in a sea of hostility trying to raise up his people.
I agree with you, my brother. Let's hand over to Brother Anika. Family, if you want to join us, the link is in the chat, and I'm going to put it in the description as well. So if you want to ask Brother Ifayomi a question, add to the knowledge and the information that he has shared, or even challenge him respectfully, feel free to do so. Brother Anika, Tenamwani.
Tenamwar, thank you very much for the presentation. I actually joined a bit late because, ironically, I was working late. I don't own my own business or my own means of production, so I have to go to someone else for for employment. But from what I caught of it, thanks for the presentation. My question is a bit of a two-part question. Looking at, Papa Garvey, the UNIA and that era, and comparing it to now in terms of business. Now, in this era, there's a lot of talk, a lot of ideas and action towards starting your own business, whether it's as an individual or as a collective. And a lot of those businesses are, I would say, at the end point of, we say that the factors of production. So it's the retail sector, it could be the tertiary sector, if it's a service or whatever it might be. But there's not a lot of emphasis on the agricultural or the manufacturing or things basically at the start of the process. And if we look at the UNIA, as far as I've learned and I've studied, the UNIA were concerned on controlling all the different areas leading from the start to the end of that whole economic process. I look at a lot of the businesses that we have, whether it might be, let's say, food stores or convenience stores, anything like that. And a lot of the wholesalers that we go to are from people outside of our community, which therefore affects our product at the end point of that line because of how much we're buying the products for. You speak about the ships. We're buying it maybe for more expensive than other communities might be buying from wholesalers, and therefore we have to sell more expensive at the other end, which ruins or destroys the competitiveness that we have with other businesses. Would you say that we've gone away from focusing on or aiming to controlling the start of the process, which is arguably, if maybe not arguably, the most important, and we're just focused on the end point, starting a business, being at the front of, the face of it, so to speak. Everyone can see what you're doing, but in reality, because you don't control what's happening at the start of the process, you are more susceptible to those businesses closing down. And we've got a number of businesses, if we're talking about, shops that was on high streets, etc., that have closed down in the last decade or 2 decades. And maybe part of it is because we're not focusing on the start of the process, but more just concerned at the end of the process.
Yes, thank you for the question. You've picked up a number of different points all with one question. I suppose immediately the terms that came to my mind were means of production. So you're talking about the means of production, which obviously Marcus Mosiah Garvey understood the need to control the whole process, which is about what they call vertical integration. So when you actually look at on a global level, we're involved at the beginning and at the end, because we're involved in extracting raw materials in Africa, but then we don't necessarily actually control that process. We don't control the refinement. We don't control the manufacturing. Then we're involved, you said, at the very end, which is the kind of retail end of things, and normally small businesses. When you look at the businesses we engage in now, they're what you call low entry cost businesses. So my view has always been our people don't engage in those businesses because of lack of ideas. They engage in those businesses because of lack of capital. Because your kind of typical dumpling shop or barbers or hairdressers, it's a low entry cost business. You essentially you could rent you could rent the shop front for a barber's. You put in a couple of chairs, some mirrors, get some pictures up on the wall. Buy you whatever tools you need. Which you've got a business going. And then you might rent out one of the chairs to another, barber to work in there. These are low entry cost business. They don't involve the purchase of high cost capital equipment. And because we're a people who are capital poor, that's why we go into that end. We get in where we fit in where we can get in, or get in where we can fit in. That's one of the reasons I think why we're always particularly attracted to network marketing schemes, because they say they'll make you rich and they don't cost much to go into. So how Marcus Mosiah Garvey was able to overcome that was through the simple means of pooling capital. So you get a lot of people individually don't have much money, but when they put it together, they can actually then start to make things. They can make hats. They can set up the laundries. They can buy the trucks. They can buy the ships, because that money's been pooled. And obviously the word capital is with capitalism, but you need capital in order to be able to move on to, when I spoke about the need to actually enter the productive sort of hierarchy, and I talked about things like textiles and making socks and all those kind of things, which are at the lower end, you still need the capital to be able to buy the equipment to produce those goods and services. So I think it's a problem of capital rather than a problem of ingenuity or ideas. I mean, I'm always seeing YouTube videos from Africa I was watching one, this boy has made his model aeroplane, and he's got all these bits and pieces, and he's about 15 years old. There's genius there, but how do he transform that into a business? He's talking about his father's ill and he can't afford to buy the bits for his models and all the rest of it. So that's the problem we have, is lack of accumulated capital. And that's what Marcus Mosiah Garvey recognized, and that's why I talked about the self-funding. People had to pay in because he needed to pool their money in order to create the enterprises that could create the employment for people.
That brother.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Feel free to stay there or depart as you may wish. Brother Gordon, you're up.
Murray, can you hear me?
Brother Gordon. Yes, Brother Gordon.
All right, greetings. All the best for Messiah Month.
Greetings.
Good to hear from you, Ifayomi. It's been a while.
Greetings, Brother Golden.
Okay, good. Right, I got two points I want to make. First of all is I'll start with the question: how do we really build economic empowerment with all the fragmentation of ideas and beliefs that we have? The way I see it is that back in the 1920s and 30s, the definitely, I don't want to say we were more simpler in ideas, but to galvanize behind one leader and behind one set of ideas, it seemed to mobilize people because, as you said,
sorry, Brother Gordon, if you could you back up 5 seconds, please, because you cut out for a bit. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Okay.
I heard the bit you said back in the 1920s.
Yeah, 1919. Garvey is able to build an organization from 20 million to 6 million. But really, when we look around the world too, with the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks, they're talking like hundreds or millions of people. Chinese Revolution, thousands of people. So is it because of that era they were able to galvanize so many people into like single organizations because of what was going on in the world, right? That's one question, right? Because we find it so difficult to, well, just in this country alone, to bring organizations alone to do anything economic or political or anything because of the fragmentation. So the question again is, how do we overcome that? And the second question again is to what my young brother was talking about earlier, is the means of production, the start of the process, the manufacturing, along with the economic ability, we need the education, right? Because our young people, what I find, well, I've been in science and technology. That's what my day job has been. And I find that a lot of the young people coming through, everybody's doing the social sciences, the arts, the media. We have lots of that, but there's not people creating technological things or doing the science. We seem to shy away from that kind of endeavor. So what I think needs to be done is education, because Garvey had the expertise that he could have drawn on to be engineers, to run the ships, and to do the factories and that. I think now we've too many of us are doing. We probably need all the creative subjects and culture, yes, but we're not doing enough for the technology, the science, to start the factories and everything. Again, one short point again is that, you know, in Africa we can produce the raw materials, but turning them into finished goods, that's where we fall down. And that, as you said before, with China and Japan, with those examples, they was able, years ago we used to laugh at them for cheap goods, but now there's anything on the planet they can produce, from an airplane to a pin. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Right, there's some good questions. I'm just making a couple of notes. Okay, first question about fragmentation of ideas. Is it harder now to build people into a larger organization? Was it to do the time? I think yes, the sort of, they call it zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. It was kind of revolution in the air to a large degree, and I think that does impact on all people across the world. People hear of how the world changed. I mean, you know, Mosiah Garvey inspired many people. I think Ho Chi Minh came to one of his talks, and there was that sense of, there was that nascent sort of anti-colonial movement that was growing. Obviously, later on, inspired Nkrumah and many other people. So, and I think also to be frank, the oppression was more in your face. to be honest with you, we've got a lot of material trinkets nowadays. Certainly you think in the place like the UK, you compare our lives to what they would have been like 100 years ago in the UK, or say 100 years ago in the United States, just in terms of your basic material needs. They are more catered for now. You talk about 100 years in the United States, there's was mentioned, the lynchings were absolutely blatant, in your face, common occurrences. We still see some of the modern day equivalents, but the frequency and the openness and just the rawness of the racism was so raw then that it, in a way, forced Africans to, unless you had no sense whatsoever, to think we've got to band together as a people. Whereas, nowadays we have ideas like integration and that we can, run away from for Africanness. So I think there is, in a sense, there's some more difficulties that we face particularly, I think, in the richer world, in terms of trying to get our people to think that we need to organize. But I suppose what I would always say is that you don't have to necessarily think I'm going to build an organization of 6 million people. That might be quite ambitious, but why not just get a group of 15 people and you all put your money together and you start a business? That can be, that can be that could be your little legacy as a group to your children and generations below. They can observe you doing that, and they can think, well, mom, dad, whatever, uncle, auntie did that. They can benefit from it, and it might also inspire them to say, okay, when we do that, we'll do it, but we'll do it twice as big, or we'll do it better. So, start where you can, plant a seed. It doesn't necessarily have to be a seed that's going to grow into a 6 million person organization. It may grow into a 20-person organization. But if it's addressing some of our needs in a practical way, then that's beneficial. I mean, there's something I'm working on at the moment, which is about trying to address some of this, but it's not quite ready for public kind of disclosure. But it is about trying to address some of these things that we need to do, as well as to recognize some of the problems that can come with one large organization. Because one of the problems with one large organization is that if you make certain critical attacks, you can bring the whole edifice down. Whereas if you have lots of, say, medium-sized organizations, you have many heads that they've got to try to cut off. So we need to also think about sometimes the dangers of just one monolithic organization. Then in terms of your second question about means of production and technology, I have to say I wholeheartedly agree with you. I've been almost chased out of certain business when I say certain buildings where I say we've got too many social workers and not enough scientists. But it is true. I mean, I'm probably a sinner myself because my degree was in chemistry and I didn't go on and use chemistry. But so I'm a sinner for not using that. But one thing I do say is that some scientific education does help you to think in a logical way, does help you to be able to feel comfortable dealing with numbers, being able to problem solve. And these are all things which are useful in the world of, the commercial world and the world of enterprise. You need to be able to feel comfortable in dealing with numbers, reading balance sheets, cash flow forecasts, those kind of things. So I think you talk about a broader problem in the education of African children, which is around the whole issue of STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And there's a very good reason why our children are moved and pushed towards social sciences. In a way, the kind of caring kind of jobs reflect our caring nature, but they also reflect the kind of plantation work that we did, which was, like wet nurses. I don't know if everyone's familiar with wet nurses on the plantations. The African women used to breastfeed their enslavers' children. We've been having those sort of mammy and uncle roles from the plantation into the present day society. We're always taking the role of carer, caretaker. And the way in which the world is being run is through science and technology. And so our children are pushed away from those subjects and sometimes develop an almost sort of fear of maths and numbers. And we can't function in this world without being able to deal with numbers. So, I mean, for example, a group I'm involved in, Nubian Link, I mean, it's not so active now, but for many years we ran a program called Africans in Science, in Nottingham. And what we used to do, we were a self-funded group, so we would run an annual award. We'd write to every school in Nottingham, every secondary school, and we'd ask them to nominate African children who were excelling or showing significant improvement in STEM subjects. And we'd hold like a public event. We'd hire a hall, invite the children, their parents, invite the local newspaper, and we would, recognize those children, give them awards, vouchers and plaques and things for those who are doing well. And that was just part of an effort to raise the profile of science and technology amongst our children, and to say that it's important, because most people aren't going to make it as rappers or footballers or whatever the high paid dream is that lots of young people have. But that's what they see often in the media. But the STEM subjects are where the higher paid jobs are, as well as the most profitable businesses are. Well, you look at the most profitable businesses in the world, which are Apple, Facebook and Amazon. Now you look at them, all underpinning all of those businesses is science and technology. Technology underpins all the base of all those businesses. So, and you talk about Apple, obviously exploitation as well in terms of how they get their phones manufactured. But what I'm saying is that if we look at where the world is, we have to, as you say, focus on STEM, competence, numeracy, scientific numeracy, not just sort of linguistic numeracy, has to be key. So I would definitely, I remember paying for my children to do Kumon to support them in their mathematics. We really need to address, and you need to address it early before the children develop a fear of mathematics and numbers. So it has to be early, that every parent needs to say, whether my child is going to be a scientist or not, I need to at least get them to be comfortable with dealing with numbers, because whatever world they go into, if it's a world to do with commerce and business, they're going to have to be able to deal with numbers. So I wholeheartedly agree with you on that.
So it should be a focus of our Saturday schools then.
Absolutely. I mean, there was a network called the African and Caribbean Science and Technology Network, which unfortunately ended. But what they did, they ran science and technology Saturday schools, where the only things they taught there was science and technology. So they taught mathematics, they taught computer science, and they taught engineering principles. They had one for a while because we were trying to. I went up with again with the group Nubian Link. We went up to visit the founder in Manchester, and she was an engineer, because we wanted her to bring the concept. She had one in, I think, in Manchester, Liverpool. Wanted to bring it to Nottingham, because again we recognize, which is one of the reasons why we did the Africans in Science program. We recognize that our children were underperforming, particularly in mathematics, because if you look at the GCSE results, even when our children are performing reasonably well in GCSEs, a lot of the time, and particularly for African children of Caribbean descent, even more so, they're not performing well in mathematics. And of course, normally, you have to get your pass in mathematics, you pass in English, often to go into to university. And so we really need to address this issue, and it needs to become something that is spoken about more widely. And I'm not saying we never need social workers, we do, but you can have too much of a good thing. We need to have a more balance. And also, as I said, there's just more, if we're talking about raising our people's economic welfare, there's better paid work in STEM subjects than there are in the kind of social care sector. So yeah, there's something we definitely need to think about and to focus on.
And one last point through the chair, just to say, I'm just offering my service for if anyone wants to know about wood technology, I'm your man.
We know that, factually speaking, because every year we get the good Canaras during Kwanzaa. We can be a testimony to that.
Anything to do with technology, I'm out there to help and teach or whatever. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Give thanks, Brother Gordon, and give thanks. Stay tuned. Get to that worry, to that worry. Right, Kings and Queens, the link is in the chat, yeah? So anybody who wants to come through and do like Brother Gordon and Brother Neeks have done. I want to send a special shout out to Queen Mother Nzinga Asata, who has joined us this evening, Kings and Queens, who's watching. And, you know, yeah, feel free to come through, Queen Mother Nzinga, if you want to ask a question or, you know, have shed some light on this topic or anything, yeah? The floor will be yours. So the link is in the chat, Kings and Queens, or in the description to the video. Hit the link where it says join the conversation and follow the prompts, and you'll be able to come through. Brother Ifayomi, I've got a few questions, and that last exchange here has prompted a whole next set of questions that is probably a whole nother presentation, yeah? But because it's a deep one. And I agree in the sense of having a son, you know, I'm conscious of developing his understanding and knowledge in science and maths, yeah, knowing, you know, studying Amos Wilsoning and knowing that oftentimes these are areas that, you know what I mean, we're, you know, geared away from and sometimes have difficulty in, yeah, because of the context of our education. At the same time, when I put it up against the social scientists, yeah, the social sciences, sorry, in as much as psychology is a social science, yeah, in as much as education systems are institutions of socialization, yeah, even more than education, especially in a society such as this, yeah. And in as much as the people that run our schools, you know, prisons, the government, yeah, are often social scientists in the areas of sociology or economics or politics, yeah, and these kinds of things. It appears to me that for our community, if we're putting it in a Garveyian perspective, that there's a key role for the social scientists in informing the purpose of the natural scientists and the technology, if that makes sense. So is it more that our political objectives are not clear, rather than the social sciences have less validity in today's world?
No, I think it's a case of it's not either or, it's both. But at the moment, we don't have balance.
Right.
We don't have sufficient numbers of people going in and studying life sciences, physics, chemistry, mathematics, studying engineering. We don't have enough people studying become doctors. I remember when we were first looking at putting on the Africans in Science Award, we went through and looked at the UCAS figures for entry into university by, and they had breakdown by ethnicity. And I think at the time, this was back in the 90s, or something like 3 what they described as like Black Caribbean people going in to study medicine in the country. And there was about, the biggest subject was sociology, and there was about 300. So what I'm saying is that I'm not saying that these things are invalid. You know, my sister's a psychologist, but what I'm saying is you need balance. You can't build a society on social sciences. You know, for example, you go to Africa, they need clean water. A sociologist isn't necessarily going to give them clean water. So I think it's just about balance. You need people who can understand the law. If you look at MPs, most of them are lawyers. The ones who come to the top a lot. If you want one single profession, it'd be lawyers. If you look at business, most chief executives, or a lot of them, have got finance backgrounds. Very often, the chief finance officer becomes a chief executive. But you need balance in everything. You need, you know, healthcare professionals. You obviously need healthcare for your mind. So you need your psychologists and psychiatrists, and you do need people who think about social problems, philosophical problems, spiritual problems. But what I'm saying is that we haven't got the balance right. And even if you are even if you're a social worker, there's no reason why you can't understand numbers.
I agree.
And feel comfortable. So I'm just talking about, you know, getting that was our slogan actually in Nubian. It was getting the balance right, and I think that's what we were concerned about. We're like a 2-wheel car with both the wheels on one side of it.
Bro, I have come across some studies that suggest that there's a significant upsurge in this country in terms of Black youth studying business. Does your research suggest the same? And where would you into your analysis?
Well, business is not a a science, a hard science. I mean, economics, in my view, is not a science.
Right.
It uses scientific methods. So econometrics uses, they can use some very complex mathematics, but it's not a science. I mean, if you get 100 economists in the room, they'll come up with probably 101 different theories about how economy works. Whereas basically, you know, if you get 100 chemists in the room and you say, what happens if you put A and B together in a test tube? They'll say it produces C, and they'll tell you how it produces C, which is not to invalidate the study of economics, but it's not a hard science or true science. I'd see it as an art that uses scientific methods.
Right. And so where would you place business or economics in the subjects that we need to be, our children and children's children need to be studying towards nation building?
I think I would say, probably my view, economics is probably more important than business, because from what I see, most business courses don't actually teach you how to run a business. They just teach you how to work for somebody who's got a business. If you think of, if you think of most business sort of so-called titans, they didn't study business at university. A lot of them sometimes didn't even go to university. Business doesn't really, from what I see, I run a small business, and from what I see of business graduates, they don't learn. I've seen people who study business. It doesn't teach them really how to run a business. It teaches them how to work for a business. Just like MBAs generally, I think, are, unless your employer pays for it, I would never myself pay for an MBA. But if my employer said they'll pay for it, then fine. I don't think they're worth the investment from an economic return point of view. So I think economics would be more important as something to study, in my view.
Right. And which kind of brings me, so when you say that we're not studying the sciences enough here, are you applying that specifically to the UK? Like, if we take Africa and the Caribbean into consideration, does that statement still ring true?
No, not so much, because if you, for example, if you look at Africa, the problem they have there actually is probably insufficient university places, insufficient educational channels to let people go through and on to study. But there's lots of brilliant scientists being produced, and I just said there is a difference between, you look at the achievement levels of Africans, kind of direct lineage through from Africa in the UK, and Africans who've got a kind of Caribbean sort of line of descent. There's a difference in terms of studying of science, and there's a difference in terms of achievement. So more in the Caribbean and Africa, it's more a question of, particularly in Africa, it's more a question of access to education and being able to get the opportunity, whereas here there is definitely a problem in the UK, and similar one in the United States.
Right. So kings and queens, the link is in the chat and the description to the video. If you want to come ask Brother Ifayomi a question, you're lucky, because Brother Ifayomi's presentation was relatively short, and so that means we've got more time for Q&A and discussion. So questions, comments, additions to the knowledge, and respectful challenges are all welcome. Hit the link in the description. I want to send a special shout out to any of our international viewers. Welcome. And all of our viewers who are out of London as well, because Brother Ifayomi is out of London, and I can see Sister Shola of SAR Events in Birmingham is in the building also. But yeah, brothers and sisters, I'm an inquisitive guy, and I'm used to interviewing people, so I would have Brother Ifayomi here a whole night asking him questions on this subject, right? So don't allow me to just run away with the questions then, because what I mean, I would take advantage. All right, so I just want to make all that and come true and break it off a little piece, bro. I'm gonna read something, because it's on this subject here, from a speech by Brother Amos Wilson, and I've come across it before, but I cannot relocate the speech. So unfortunately, giving a source for it is gonna, until I find it again, is gonna be very difficult. But trust me, he did say it, and once I find it, I will make sure that I'll place it somewhere. But he says, so see, science doesn't just pop up because you know science, or just because you're some scientific genius. It must be what? Supported, And African science and technology in the hands of African people will not become so until African cultures support that science and until African economic systems can afford to pay for it. And that's why an African who majors in engineering and chemistry must also major in political science and government and economics and other things. That's why, as an African, you got to be much more broadly educated than a European, because the Europeans have already structured their system economically, socially, and so forth. So therefore, they can send their young in and give them a narrow scientific education that's just based purely on technique, because all of the other parts are put together. But in nations that are developing, the scientists themselves have to also have a working knowledge of related areas so that they can build a structure necessary for the growth and development of science. So when you go to European institutions where you are just taught chemistry alone, and math alone and so forth, you still have not yet become an African scientist. You understand? And simply because you're sitting on those courses and they're not talking about economics doesn't mean you're getting a necessary and appropriate education. An African science class discusses politics and economics along with science and technology. You have to understand these kinds of things. Yeah. Now, the reason why I've read that extended quote is because of what you were saying earlier when Brother Anika was speaking in terms of entry-level cost for getting into an industry, yeah? And so with the current world economic system, it stands to reason that for the majority of us, starting a business in science is going to be very difficult. So if we get qualified in the sciences, most of the time, we're going to be eligible just for being hired by non-Africans, if that makes sense. Yeah. And so there's a number of questions in there. The one I'm going to ask is, however, do you see any avenues for us overcoming that contradiction, that we want to get educated in sciences, but getting educated in sciences we can only use that right now to be employed by white people or Chinese people or Japanese people? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, I think that's the challenge of any business, which is the same problem of capital.
Right.
But you know, there are, for example, the development of apps.
Right.
I know people who've set up companies where they develop apps, and they've been able to do it through their own resources as well as leveraging resources as well. So if you're talking about setting up a huge biotechnology company, then yeah, you're talking about some serious issues of capital. So the issues about access to capital is going to be a problem, whether it's a hard science business or whether it's a chain of shops making clothes. If you're talking about scale, it requires some degree of capital investment. And that's going to be a problem for anyone. So whatever you training, whether it's be as the social worker, whether it's as chemist, the likely first port of call is going to be, and I think for anyone's going to be, a job to sort of cement your skills. Then being able to translate that into a business depends on not only your entrepreneurial mindset, but whether you've got the resources available to you. And if you don't have it, does your family have it? If they don't have it, someone else, a business investor, or can you borrow it? And that becomes an issue. So yeah, that's always going to be an issue when you talk about trying to get into any line of business. It's a real problem.
All right, give thanks, Brother Ifayomi. Kings and Queens, we're gonna go on for another, let's say, 40 minutes. Yeah, so get your questions in. You can type your questions in the chat also. So if you don't want to come live, feel free to type your questions in the chat of the video and we will read them out. Try to at Alkebu-Lan way so I can see them. But truly said, the chat is not overly active right now. I should be able to catch them anyway. Auntie Pat in Oxford, greetings and welcome.
Greetings everybody. Greetings.
We got
everybody okay?
Fine,
so we just think because we just find it. So I said I must come in. And greetings to everybody.
Greetings. Yeah, you have a question for Brother Ifayomi?
Not quite yet, because I've just come from another Zoom, so I'm just coming in here.
Oh, okay. Well, feel free to just watch on YouTube, Auntie. If you go to our YouTube channel, you can just watch if you just want to watch. Yeah. You're welcome to do so. All right. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
In the meantime, I'm going to put you in the back end. You'll still be able to listen, but when you want to come through, just let me know and I'll bring you back through.
No problem.
All right. All right, big up Auntie Pat and the whole of the Outer London crew. You don't know, and it's one of the beauties, kings and queens of the current situation, and the fact that we're online. Africans from all over the world can tune in and take part. Right, brother EX in the chat, brother Ifayomi says, should we have a black tax?
I'd need to know what brother EX means by black tax. It's a it could mean a whole heap of things. So I need to, if he could just perhaps explain a little bit more what he means by that.
Yes. All right. So brother EX, feel free to type that or to come live and expound upon it. Yeah. I'm going to ask you a theoretical question now, brother Ifayomi, and then I've got a practical one to follow that up. In fact, so you mentioned this book, yeah? Tribes. Yeah. Now, I don't know how you came to know about this book, but I came to know about it from reading Blueprint for Black Power by Amos Wilson, because he mentions this book in there. And as a result, you know, like when you read a book, you get the books that are referenced in the book. So I got that, right. And I haven't finished it, so I haven't even got to that part yet. But I do know that he mentions Marcus Garvey. He actually also mentions him in the introduction, but only in passing in this paragraph. So he's going through. Let me just read it. Yeah. In this respect, he says, the history and development of global tribes is particularly enlightening. Clearly identifiable values such as strong ethnic identity, a belief in self-help, hard work, thrift, education, and the family have proved universally successful in all these different groups. Stripped of the burdens of Cold War ideology of racism, the relationship between such values and such group success is simply too self-evident to ignore. This perspective already has produced, among other things, a critical debate among groups such as African Americans, in contrast to the legalistic civil rights orientated traditions of the Black establishment. African American leaders, as different in temperament and approach as Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Louis Farrakhan, and Tony Brown, have emphasize the importance of developing a more self-affirming, economically and intellectually self-sufficient social culture as the primary means of overcoming racial oppression. Similarly, as the appeal of Marxism wanes in Africa, Latin America, and other parts of the developing world, the focus on the development of such values has also shifted as peoples look for clues to the success of the Japanese or the overseas Chinese rather than mimic the old Soviet model. Yeah. So when we look at the Chinese and Japanese, these are people that were able to develop economic systems, you know, based upon to some degree their own culture. And you mentioned that in the presentation. Yeah. So as African people, if we are yet to develop African-centered economic theory, what avenues would you suggest are worthy of study and investigation for developing such an African-centered economic theory?
Okay, well, I did write a book. Well, not a book, a pamphlet. When did I write this? I wrote this in, hasn't even got a year on it, actually. I wrote it probably, 2009.
Right.
So I wrote a small pamphlet called Let's All Pull Together, Ifawosowopo Economics. So Ifawosowopo is I think it's a Yoruba word, means let's all pull together. So within this pamphlet, what it's called is a cultural philosophical paradigm for African economic policy development and implementation. So the idea behind this, I've not got on to what's meant to follow. It was meant to be it was an introductory text to begin to flesh out an African economic paradigm. And the idea was I was going to write the full book, which I still intend to do when I get the time. But this was, it's only quite short. It's 36 pages in length.
Right.
So it was just, so what I did a brief critique of capitalism, socialism, and then I laid out, so I put the philosophical foundation of capitalism and socialism, and then I began to set out the similarities and differences between capitalism and socialism, and then I set out what I think are some of the philosophical tenets of Ifawosowopo economics. So yeah, we do need to do this work. It would be great if our economists who are got the full-time freedom to do this work could do that, because if I had more time I would write the book in about 6 months. But it's what we do need to do. But in terms of returning to your so I was simply, I suppose, trying to say that I recognize what you said, and 11 years ago I started work towards building around addressing that, and I've been doing more reading since. So if I was to write this pamphlet again, I'd probably write it a bit differently, but that's always the way of writing books. You write a book and then 6 months later you think, oh, why didn't I put that in it? Why didn't I say that? But that work does need to be done. And in relation to what you said about Amos Wilson and a chemist, if they're not grounded in their own culture, it's the same with economics. If you're not grounded in your own history and culture, then you'll only see the world exclusively through the prism of, say, Adam Smith or Karl Marx, or maybe one's derivative of them. I mean, in the Black economics course that I run, I take people through 10 different economic sort of ideologies or approaches, including Marxism and sort of neoliberal capitalism, all those sort of things. But if you don't have that, you'll only see economics through what you'll be taught. And for example, if you're in Africa, the books you'll get will probably be written by European economists and will teach you a history of economics from that perspective. Same in Caribbean, same here. So that is true. Now, in terms of what we can learn, shall I say something a little bit controversial? One of the things in the book, which I put in presentations before, which I suppose, depending on your religious beliefs, doesn't always land too well. But I did a table which was called The Relationship Between Language, Religion and Power, which essentially I looked at a number of countries. So there's a table, which I don't know if I can show my screen at all. If people
you can. So this one, and you can share it again. Oh, you want to show it from there?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's literally a book. Let me see if I can go.
You can't see it clearly, but
okay. Look, I'll just read and tell you what it says. Okay, cool. So there's basically 4 columns. First is country. The second is institutional language. That's the language used within their, like the educational institutions, business, law, that kind of stuff. The third is dominant religion, and the fourth is world power level. So country, institutional language, dominant religion, world power level. So I take this from the work of I think it may have been Asa Hilliard who did it first, but I know Femi Biko picked up on it in '98, which is about the 2 legs of culture, which are essentially language and spirituality or religion. And so I looked at Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana, Jamaica, China, Japan, South Korea, India, USA, Germany, UK, France, Italy, and essentially just demonstrated. Now, you may say it's correlation or you may say it's causation, but demonstrated there's a very, very strong correlation between world power and using your own indigenous language and practicing your own indigenous spiritual or religious system. The Chinese don't have a religion, but they've got Confucianism as their philosophy, which is indigenous philosophy. So that's one of the most difficult lessons, given that we're so splintered religiously, is that all the powerful nations in the world operate from their own cultural well as their foundation.
Interesting point there. Interesting point. We give thanks for that, brothers and sisters. All right. Once again, you can join the conversation by clicking the link in the description. As much as we can, we've got about half an hour left. Or we'll close when we come to a natural point of closure. Brother Leon Thomas in the chat is asking, given the fact that we are in difficult economic times of uncertainties, what can we do quickly on the ground to improve the finances of our people?
Okay, well, there's a number of things we can do.
Sorry, brother, before you answer that, the book, the pamphlet that you mentioned, is it available?
Not really, because it's kind of, I've got 20 left, and they're all meant to be going to somebody in the United States, because essentially somebody's buying the last few boxes of my books, and including the booklet. But I do have it electronically, so I could probably send it to you electronically. I've obviously got the I've got the text written out electronically, because I could send that to you.
Please do, but I was more talking about for people if they wanted to get it when they're listening, those who are viewing at the moment.
Yeah, it's out of print apart from the last 20. I mean, I remember printing about 500 copies of it, and I used to sell it for like £1 or £2 when I was at events selling my main books. So it's mainly been, there's probably people out there who've got it, but I can send it to you, and if you want to sort of let people share it, I don't mind you sharing it with other people.
Please, yeah, I'd like to read it. But so basically, what you're saying, that we're really gonna have to wait for the book.
Well, you know, buddy, if there's somebody out there, write the book. I mean, don't just wait on me. I mean, I've given this as a little contribution. Somebody can build on it and improve it and tear it apart. I mean, that's what we need to do. We just build on what comes and make it better.
I will confess it is something that I am studying periodically, not consistently, but like looking at like Ujamaa of Julius Nyerere in Tanzania. You know, that model, what Nkrumah was trying to do, what Maurice Bishop and the New Jew movement were doing in Grenada, you know what I'm saying, in terms of development, and seeing, you know, studying our indigenous societies, which is a difficult part of the process. You know what I'm saying? to glean the economic principles from it. So yeah, it's an ongoing work, kings and queens, but we look forward to coming to some critical, you know, point within that. But yes, now to this question from Brother Leon Thomas. Do I need to read it again, or are you all right?
I can see it there in front of me.
Cool.
I suppose it's like when I run my Black economics course, there's part of it that deals with macroeconomics, but then there's part of it that deals with sort of personal finance. So if you remember the 5 legs that we had up, sort of 5 stools of the 5 legs of the economic stool, it really depends on where you are in terms of your personal situation. So for example, if you're really focused around the debt stool, that you've got plenty of debts, then that's really needs to be your preoccupation and focus. So the first thing you need to do probably is get advice. You know, go to your Citizens Advice Bureau. There's other free debt charities as well, and deal with your debts. Make sure you've got a budget, and actually deal with just the day-to-day bit of actually getting your finances under control. Then you think about, as part of that process, you look at consumption. So you have a budget, and you say, okay, what is it I can cut out? What is it I don't need to spend my money on? How can I, you know, make it work the best for me, so I can even just start to create a little bit of room for savings? Then once you've created some room for a little bit of savings, you're thinking about, okay, how can I actually start to earn more money? So are there things I can have a little side hustle? Is there something I can do where maybe a second job, or something I can do, or do some more training and get a promotion, get a better paid job that will give you a little bit more breathing space, and you can start to build your rainy day fund? Because ideally, what we're always saying is that you need to try and get enough money away so that if you lost your job, you could be able to function for another 6 months. Then if you get past the point where you're starting to build that, then you say, okay, well, then I get to the point where I start to think about investing. And the key difference between investing and saving is that there's normally a risk component with investing. And then you think about what kind of investing I can do. It might be investing in someone's business. It might be investing in shares, if that's what you're interested. It might be setting up your own little small business and starting to run that. And also it could be, how can I do something productive? You may have a skill that you want to utilize. You may be able to manufacture something on a small scale. How can you get leverage finance, if you need to leverage finance, to be productive and actually create a business that makes things? So I think it really depends on where your starting point is. Now, within that kind of individual process, at a certain point, you'll get to the point where you might be able to work with other people. So for example, credit unions. You can join a credit union that can take people away from these doorstep lenders, or we can build a credit union. You only need to have a common bond. You can go to the Association of British Credit Unions. They can show you how to set a credit union up. That might be one community solution. You might be part of a partner. That might be another rotating credit association. Or you might just transform the partner idea like we did in ABDF, where instead of people taking their draw, they keep the money in and they can use it for a collective investment. So there's lots of ways we can both address the individual situation and then also start to work with other people. Ideally, if you can do it with your family or close friends, that's best, where there's trust. But I think it's that thing, every mickle make a muckle. So just start from wherever you are and look to cooperate with people who've got like mind. But first of all, you have to, as they say, on the airplane, you have to get the oxygen mask down first and put it over your own nose and mouth and get oxygen for yourself. Once you've done that, then you have the ability to, cooperate with others and also assist others as well.
Give thanks for that, brother. If I may, you kind of preempted my next question. I'm trying to find the section. I didn't mark it. I'm trying to find the section in Blueprint for Black Power where Amos Wilson deals with credit unions. Yeah. So two questions where this is concerned. There has been a significant pushback from certain sections of the activists. By the way, before I ask that question, shout out to brother Kemet Prince listening in from Trinidad. Yeah, Queens. Yeah, so yeah, we give thanks, because sometimes the current situation is a blessing and a curse, because if we were having our regular community meetings, brothers and sisters from Trinidad wouldn't be able to tune in live with us and interact. So we give thanks. Yeah. Yes, brother Ifayomi. The concept of financial literacy has been heavily critiqued. Yeah. By many of our activist brothers and sisters. It's been considered counter-revolutionary and bourgeois politics, and all of these things, yeah. And some even might consider it anti-African, yeah, in that respect. Is financial literacy necessary, especially from a Garveyite, like, kind of nationalist, Pan-Africanist perspective?
Well, I suppose the short answer in my view would be yes. But I suppose a simple question: if, let's say, one of the listeners, let's say you had a job, and if you suddenly, because of COVID, you found that you'd lost your job tomorrow, would you like to have some savings, or would you like to have none? I mean, it's as simple as that. Would you like to have something tucked away that can be there to help support you and your family, or would you like to have literally be living from paycheck to paycheck? With more month than money. So on a very simple individual level, it obviously makes sense. And if you just think of I think about parents and their upbringing, putting some money aside, whether for a pardon or whatever else, is just core part of the culture. There's nothing bourgeois about it. It's about why is it that doing things that will help you to be able to live an effective life, why would that be seen as bourgeois? Are we supposed to wait for the Great Revolution for the state to come and solve our problems? Well, some of us could be dead before that happened. So, if you're talking about living on a day-to-day basis, it's obviously sensible that people are able to look after their money and manage their money and make the best of what they have. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be increases in minimum wage. But I think, again, this is a problem with this whole dichotomous thinking idea that is one thing or the other, because I know that when I look at some of the critiques, I think some of the ADOS people cite, there's some US sort of social scientists where they often cite, I can't remember his name's Dalrymple, I'm not sure.
No, it's I'll tell you in a sec. Go on. Anyway. But
they produced a paper which was part of
that deals with the wealth gap, right?
Yes, yeah, and they had a baby bond as one of their solutions.
I'll tell you in a sec. But go, keep going.
Yeah, so I remember they had a critique and they had this video out, and I wrote a newsletter critiquing their critique. But their idea was because they seem to have moved away from reparations towards this idea of things like baby bonds, which are great if you've got babies. If you don't have a baby, then you're not going to get the baby bond. But essentially, they were taking this absolutist either or position, that if you say that we need to deal with issues of financial literacy, economic development, entrepreneurship, that somehow you're saying we don't have to deal with things like, structural racism, minimum wage, sort of structural things within the support network within the society. We're saying you don't have to address those things. Of course you have to address those things, reparations, all those things. It's not an either or, it's a both. Just like, if we're talking about issues we have individually with education, there may be structural factors at work, but it doesn't mean there aren't things we can do individually to address those problems.
Yeah. I remember the name is Brother William Darity.
That's it, Darity. Yeah. I read the paper. I can't remember the whole critique I wrote because it's quite long.
Yes. Now, brother, Ifayomi, brother Amos Wilson, in some of his speeches, speaks about the difference between banks and credit unions, and he suggests that for our stage of development and our cooperative collective goals, credit unions might be more appropriate an institution for us to develop than black-owned banks. Would you agree with that assessment? And what would be the differences between the two? And why would we prefer one over the other?
Well, I suppose maybe start with differences. Well, one of the things that banks can create money in a way that credit unions can't. So, you know, people may or may not be familiar with the way in which money is created. I won't go into the whole thing, but it's essentially money is created out of debt through a system called fractional reserve lending, and it then becomes even more obscure because banks are meant to have capital reserves, but they have a certain window in which they can achieve the sort of balance of reserves and debts. But credit unions can't create money in the way that banks can create money. Credit unions are regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. They're obviously much smaller in scale. I mean, you can get some very large credit unions in the United States. In Britain, they're much smaller than a bank, have much less capital, and they tend to be much more grassroots, and they work around what they call common bonds. So, for example, I'm a member of a credit union in Nottingham, the Nottingham Credit Union, which is kind of the merger of two credit unions, and now I think they're trying to combine themselves with a Lincolnshire Credit Union. But credit unions are much smaller, much easier, scalable in terms of setting them up. It doesn't actually require that large amount of money, so it becomes very doable for, if you had 100 people, you could probably have the base of setting up a credit union. You can go to the Abacore website, they have all the paperwork, and it normally takes, from their guidance, when I've looked at their website, they reckon about 2 to 3 years from having the idea to actually having the credit union up and running, you know, to be able to get it started. If you're talking about a bank, you're probably talking about maybe needing to raise maybe £20 million, you know, in this country to start meeting the requirements for a very small bank. So as you can see, it's a very different kettle of fish. I'm not saying it's not doable. In fact, I got if I can find it on my phone, I received a message, I think, from some brothers and sisters who are trying to set up a black bank in this country. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, it's where is it here? Yeah, I think it's Platinum Peak. They say they're trying to set up a bank to address the economic inequality felt by a community in the marginalized. So there's some people who are trying to actually do it as we speak.
Right.
But yeah, in terms of the amount of and this person in the email said that 4 years ago they founded a bank, so it seems like they have some experience within the banking world. But I think within their documentation it says they're trying to raise £20 million initially. So it's a huge endeavor. So I'd say probably if you haven't got banking experience, it's credit union first, then do your bank later.
So the chapter in Blueprint for Black Power is financing Black economic development, yeah, and there's a number of chapters, sub chapters where he goes into banks and credit unions. I won't read it for the sake of time, but it is good reading for those who want to delve into this a little bit more. Kings and Queens, we've got 15 minutes left on the clock, Kings and Queens. Yeah, so if you want to come live and speak to brother Ifayomi, ask a question, make a statement, add to the knowledge, or even launch a respectful challenge, feel free to do so. We've got a question in the chat right now. Thank you for the show and your associated works. Quick question: what 3 businesses would a modern UNIA be involved in? Do you consider yourselves neo-Garveyite, continentalist, or other? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, that's a very
interesting question right there. So
yeah,
go ahead, Robert.
Well, I think in terms of what 3 business, I hadn't thought about. I've never been asked that question before, so I'm gonna just be freestyling it in terms of thinking about it. But I think definitely something which would be involved in sort of transportation and logistics. So maybe an updated version of, you know, of the Black Star liner. I think it's definitely something to do with agriculture, probably in Africa, and then I would think. to do with the transformation of raw materials into finished products. So whatever's, things that are raw materials found in Africa, they'll be involved in that sort of transformation process, taking them into finished products. So something around mining, probably something like that, transforming those minerals into actual finished products. I think those are kind of areas that they would be looking at. But maybe Marcus Mosiah Garvey say nanotechnology, biotechnology, robotics. I think you'd look at all the areas that are here, and maybe things like a car company. Maybe a car company, something like that, as part of the transportation, because Africa could do with a car company.
I'm going to add.
And do you consider yourself neo-Garveyite, continentalist, or other? I just say Garveyite. I wouldn't even put the neo on it. The neo just means new, I suppose. I kind of used to sort of, I say, Pan-Africanist, which I suppose I am, but because I think the meaning of the term has been corrupted. That's why I call myself, I suppose, a Garveyite, because I adhere to his version of Pan-Africanism, which is about African people first, rather than the land is more important, rather than, which some versions seem to emphasize the land rather than the people. And what's the point of the land if there's no African people? So his kind of idea of uniting the 400 million Negroes of the world, well, we've got over 1 billion Africans now, so that's what I am, a Garveyite.
Yeah, I'll answer this one as well. I agree with Brother Ifayomi. I would say if I use Pan-Africanist, I would be more specific and say Black nationalist Pan-Africanist. To be more specific, I would say Garveyite, and I would also say African fundamentalist, because that's how Marcus Mosiah Garvey defined or described his ideology. So yeah. Now, in relation to this, what three businesses would the modern UNIA be involved in? Any business that is servicing the needs of our people is the answer to that question in broad. But I'll speak for myself. I'm involved in a couple. I am involved in the development of Gotkush TV, which is a media institution, and that is because I believe that media is a key area, key business that we need to be involved in at the moment because of its role in society at the minute. There are few institutions more powerful than the media, and its role in disseminating ideas is paramount. I also have started a business that creates resources, African-centered learning resources for children. So I think it's a key business. The UNIA created Black Dolls and them kind of things there. And I'm into, at the moment helping to develop a publishing business. So that's important too. But I will say that I have heard that some brothers and sisters that are in the UNIA today are trying to develop a trotro business in Ghana. Trotro is like a kind of a independent kind of bus service, that operates in Ghana. And so brothers and sisters can establish their own trotro. So there are brothers that are trying to do that in terms of what Brother Ifayomi would say in terms of transportation. And there are a few others that I not clear in my head that are actually engaged in by the UNIA at the moment. But that kind of brings me back to something that you said in your presentation, Brother Ifayomi, which is that nations that are at the beginning stages of development, oftentimes one of the first industries that they go into is textiles. And we've got a big problem right now in the sense that 90% of the textiles that are considered African are manufactured in Holland and China. So based upon that, in terms of your research, what are some of the other entry-level industries that a developing nation goes into when they're seeking to develop self-reliance and autonomy? So we've got textiles. Are there any others?
Well, I will answer the question, but just one thing to say about this. This touches on a key aspect of economic policy that I think is really important that we're aware of. Almost from my research, almost every country that's achieved significant economic development, probably bar Netherlands and Chile, have at some stage in their development instituted what they call protectionist measures. That is where they've protected homegrown industries from external competition. One of the most important examples of that is the United States, where they protected their New England textile industry from higher quality, cheaper British imports.
Yes.
They knew that their their nascent industry couldn't compete initially
Mm-hmm.
because the British industry had years to develop. So they stopped British imports, allowed the textile industry to develop and flourish, and then eventually they opened their markets. And they'd always tell African countries, protectionism bad, you shouldn't do it. But Britain's done it. Britain did the same thing to protect certain parts of their textile industry at various stages from European competition, better quality European goods. So this is one of the things that we need to understand. If you read the book Bad Samaritans by Ha Jun Chang, that's Hajoon Chang, Chang. He's a Korean economist. He's one of my favorite economists to read. In that book, he compares the development of Ghana and South Korea. When Ghana gained its independence, it had almost exactly the same per capita income as South Korea. Now, when we think of Ghana and South Korea, we think of South Korea as being an affluent country, don't we, in terms of income levels? And we think of Ghana still as a pretty poor developing country. But when Ghana became independent, their per capita income was almost the same. And what he shows you is what are the measures that the South Korean government put in place in order to help develop industry and productive capacity. So there was a combination of what you call socialist measures like state-owned industries, but there was also private enterprise as well. But the private enterprise worked with the state-owned industries, and there was protection of certain industries as well to allow them to be able to develop and be competitive on a wider scale. So that book provides it's called Bad Samaritans. It provides a really good example of the hypocrisy of Europeans when they're always telling African countries you mustn't, you got to open your markets to free competition. So that's just an important point I wanted to say, because if you're talking about how does African countries deal with that textile industry issue, they've got to stop importing these textiles from Netherlands and all these places. And so then their people have to buy their own domestically made textiles, or they apply tariffs to those imported textiles, and they help to support their indigenous textile manufacturers by giving them better capital to buy better equipment, and so they can become more competitive and more productive. And then eventually they'll get to the point where the African-made textiles are of the same price and quality as the externally made textiles. So that's just an important point for people to remember when they hear these lots of hypocrisy that these people talk about. Basically, rich countries always believe in free competition because they have the advantage. When there were poorer countries, they didn't believe in it.
I'll tell you better than that, brother Ifayomi. When they get competition from another rich country, then they start to believe in competition again, because America, like the whole of Trump's election was littered with we need to protect our market from China, and that kind of rhetoric. So go ahead.
And I remember when Peter Mandelson was former Labour MP, when he was EU Trade Minister, he was pleading for tariffs to protect the Italian textile market. So. Socks and all these other from Chinese imports, because they said they couldn't compete with the Chinese imports, and that Italy's a quote unquote rich country.
It occurs to me that we're living in that right now when it comes to Brexit.
Yeah, well, some people may get a shock if Boris brings in the 3 million Hong Kong Chinese he's opened the door to. Some of the people might think this is not what we're voting for.
You know what I found though, brother Ifayomi, that the more right-wing white people that were so anti-immigration are more than willing to welcome the Hong Kong people them in. Yeah, it exposes the fact that this thing is pure politics. There's no reality or truth behind this thing at all. Because I've spoken to some of these white racist people, and they're like, "Nah, bring on the Hong Kong, mate. Bring them in. They deserve to be here. They got British passports. Bring them on."
Yeah, they're not so kind when it comes to Windrush, is it? They don't got such a big heart then. But
I'm telling you, it's very funny.
There's no principle at work. It's all geopolitical machinations, man. There's no principles. But in terms of other industries, I mean, I think the obvious one is agriculture. In terms of, for example, you've got countries like Kenya where huge amounts of their land are used for things like rose production, which is all shipped overseas, to European and other markets. And it requires a huge amount of water and a huge amount of fertile land being used to produce roses that, of no benefit to the people. So I think getting control of your agricultural economy so you can actually produce the food that your people need. And Africa's got huge amounts of fertile land, despite desertification. That's something that absolutely, when you talk about what should be the priorities in an African country, it's got to be about getting control of agriculture and improving agricultural technology and methods to make to increase the productive capacity of the land, because much of it is being poorly farmed at the moment. So agronomy would be a key thing for African countries to be encouraging people to be studying.
Yes. All right. So we agriculture and textiles.
There'll be two of the starting points I think that definitely should be looked at in terms of, and then when you move from that, then you'd be looking at what can we do in terms of first level, if we, for example, do mining. So if we have copper or whatever, then how do we get to the first level of being able to control the mining and then actually transforming that into the copper? You may not turn it into the real added value, but at least turn it into the finished metal or whatever it is you're pulling out. So first level kind of mining technology would be something you need to look at if you're a country, which many African countries are, that have got an abundance of minerals that are needed.
Transplant that question now to the local level. Africans in the UK, yeah. What primary entry-level industries that do we need to be collectively going into and controlling as a part of in order to be able to contribute to a broader nation-building effort?
Well, I think in a way it's slightly different in somewhere like here, the UK, as opposed to, for example, somewhere like the United States, where they've got genuine population concentration. I mean, we have some of it in London, but outside of London, there's very little, population. So we're much more dispersed. So some of the things that you could naturally do, where you have, for example, which we could still do, but you look at Chinatowns and things like that. They're easier when you have concentrations of people together. Whereas the more you go into kind of bush areas, the more difficult it is. So I think in a way, food is definitely one we should be controlling. I mean, and it was spoken about the fact that we're not even controlling the wholesale part of it, and even the import of food from for example, the Caribbean is being controlled, but for example, by Asian businesses. So that is something we should definitely get control of in terms of the foods that we know are most open to us. But I'm a firm believer in that when you're in a kind of dispersed situation, you want to take money from everybody. So we want to develop businesses where we can take money from everybody. So if it's software development, do that, take money from everybody. If you've got a shop, take money from anybody. If you've restaurants, take their money. We need to be able to utilize our skills and make sure that we take in as much resource as we can, as long as we then be able to utilize it for the benefit of our community. So I think that given how we're about 3% of the population, maybe 4% here, given our dispersed nature, I think it's more about actually how do we build the capital so that we can create the businesses, rather than saying we should just confine ourselves to a kind of narrow sphere of business. I mean, we should obviously definitely control, the hair market for women. That should definitely be within our control. Anything that's natural to your culture and your group should definitely be controlled by us. But beyond that, we should have businesses in every sort of ethical sphere that we can think of.
I must add, brother Ifayomi, that some of us as men have hair too.
Yeah. Well, probably I'm biased because I left it behind some time ago.
It also sounds like you're saying that there's a strategic benefit in all the Africans in the UK moving to London, brother Ifayomi.
Well, if you could buy us all a house, then I'll definitely come down.
I take your point. If I take it back, I take your point. Absolutely. Right, we've got 3 more questions. Yeah. Go ahead, bro. Go ahead.
I think there's probably some things that are more easier done in places like London than they are in other places. Just simply where you have that kind of proximity where people can come together and meet, and you can build almost little economic centers around places where we're concentrated. So I think some of those things are sort of easier.
Yes. All right. We've got 3 more questions, 2 from the chat and then 1 from myself here. I want to bring the conversation back to economics as it relates to Black organizations. Yeah, I think that's a good to end off, right? So the first one from the chat is, sorry for the late questions, is a leaderless movement like BLM the way forward, good and bad of that approach?
Well, a movement is different to an organization or institution. So an organization or institution needs leadership and needs leaders. A movement is really founded around often an idea. So which is what Black Lives Matters is, a kind of an idea which we can all agree with, the idea that, you know, our lives matter as much as anybody else's. So Mosiah Garvey was built a huge organization that he was trying to institutionalize, but because of external things, he wasn't able to do all the things he wanted to do. So you need to have leadership to build something like the UNIA. It needs leadership. It needs structure. It needs processes. So that's absolutely essential. What I think we need to have is that we mustn't just have everything resting on one individual, because then it puts that individual at risk and it puts the institution at risk. So we need to build layers of leadership. That's the key. And we need to have processes for bringing people through, and they kind of graduate, and through their talent, they will eventually, you know, occupy the kind of the leadership positions that are needed to be occupied.
And to be fair, we can say, like, looking at the constitution of the UNIA ACO, I've got a copy of it somewhere, that is what they did and were trying to do. Like, they had branch leaderships and structures for leadership and different of leadership and lady presidents and presidents, and you know, so there was levels to it, and obviously it because we've only achieved, you know, the UNIA ACO in the 1920s was still a very young organization, and so I remember that also, you know what I'm saying?
I mean, to a large degree, they were victims of their own success, because trying to go from like almost 0 to 2 million in a few years, I mean, I challenge anybody to be able to manage that easily. Nowadays, let alone 100 years ago.
And that's one thing I've learned from history. You know, when movements grow fast, they're very difficult to it's very difficult to maintain order. And so while we marvel at the growth of the UNIA and marvel at the growth of the Black Panther Party in short spaces of time, it's not something that I want to replicate. In that sense, you know what I'm saying? It's good, it's nice, it's glamorous, but I'm minded that slower growth is often more manageable in the long run for long-term goals and planning. You know? Yeah,
it can be like a firecracker that lights a sky up really brightly, but you know, that doesn't necessarily doesn't last the whole night long. You know, it fades out because it's just very, very difficult to control that kind of growth. But the problem is you don't plan for you probably didn't expect it to grow that quickly. You know, I don't think many people would really think, I'll grow a 2 million organization in a few years. You know, so then it becomes a problem you just have to try and manage.
And I think they did some good work, you know what I'm saying, with all the mistakes that would have been made. Final question from the chat. How important is military in economics, as a military in economics?
Well, I think, you know, we talked about the two legs of culture, where you have, essentially, you have two legs of national power. You have the economic and the military. So the economic funds the military capacity, and the military capacity defends the economic territory and assets. So if you look at again, if you look at countries, why is it that the United States hasn't attacked North Korea? North Korea doesn't have the most developed economy, but it has nuclear weapons, and it has some military threat. Why doesn't the United States attack China? Although it is attacking it in an economic way, but China has both economic strength and military strength. Russia has less economic strength, although, you know, some economic strength, but has significant military strength. So if you want to protect your economic gains, you need to have a military that can defend. Essentially, you need to be able to make blood run from the nose of your enemy. That's a kind of layperson's way of thinking about it. You know, what does a bully fear? A bully's fear is somebody who can stand up to them. Bullies are not looking for a fight. They're looking for an easy victim. the person who, when they say give me your money, the person will give it to them because they're scared. If the bully thinks the potential victim is going to smash them in the face and make their nose bleed, they just move on to the next victim. So you have to develop military capacity to go hand in. And that's why it was silly for the ANC to give away all the nuclear developments that the Afrikaners have been doing and all their other sort of high-level military developments as part of this, Rainbow Coalition nation.
All right, kings and queens. By the way, I hasten to add that the racist government in South Africa would not have been able to get that military capacity, that nuclear capacity, had it not been for Israel. And I'll leave that there. What's it called? My final question here is in relation to Black organizations, and our economic development as organizations in our community. The one thing that the UNIA had that we don't have at the moment is capacity, people capacity, in terms of mass numbers, and so oftentimes organizations are preoccupied with acquiring those numbers, to do certain work, and I'll be honest with you. So I delivered a presentation during Mosiah a couple of years ago titled "Are Black Organizations Dead?" In fact, I referenced some of your work quite heavily in that presentation, and I was critical, and I have been critical of this over preoccupation with getting numbers, whilst stagnating the potential of the numbers that I hear, if that makes sense. That's not to say that we shouldn't get numbers, like go out and recruit, but I feel like there's potential for doing things as we are right now that maybe we're not taking advantage of, and I'm prepared to be told that I'm wrong in my critique, however, looking at the state of Black organizations, that I know you have done, and the conscious community, just the numbers as they are now, do you consider there to be a significant level of untapped potential in terms of avenues for economic development that we're maybe not employing at the moment for whatever reason? It's a very broad question, but I'm gonna leave it there and let you go with it.
Yeah, I suppose that I agree with your broad critique. I mean, when there's, I suppose, two examples I'd probably give. I mean, at the moment, I said I'm working on something with some other people, and we've not promoted it very heavily. We did an initial canvassing of opinion, see if people are interested in the general concept, and now we've got about 50 people who are on, who seem genuinely interested. But we're not trying to grow that number, because what we want to do is to spend the next few months working up the concept till it's really firm and strong, and we have it really properly fashioned. And I think what we've learned from was the experience of the ABDF. So for those who don't know, the listeners, that was the African Business Development Fund, which I was one of the co-founders of, which we founded in 1996. And I think one of the things that we learned, because there's been a lot of ABDF ran for 20 years, and at its peak we had 128 shareholders, and based all over the country, both any sort of town or city of significant size. We probably had a member in the UK, and we at the end actually we had people in the US who wanted to join, but I think one of the mistakes we made was we didn't get it right at the outset, and I think, looking back, because there's been a lot of soul searching where we've talked about what went wrong and what should we have done, and there's various mistakes, but one of the things was we didn't get it right at the outset, and so things that we didn't get right come back to bite you later on down the line. So, but for example, that experience showed me that you can grow an organization, you can get people to put their money together. As I said, and we even had people in the United States who were turning where he wanted to be, because there's that hunger amongst our people. There is that genuine hunger to want to be part of it. But I think what you need to do is you've got to get the structure right and have the clarity. So now we're trying to refashion something that's going to be better, learn from the lessons, and then when we have it ready, then we're going to grow it organically. And we've got enough people interested already that we can start with them, and then once we get the model growing, then we think it will just grow through word of mouth. So I suppose what I would say is, for organizations, to me, financial input from all people who are adult and capable has to be a prerequisite of joining the organization, whether it's an overt mission is economic or not, even if it's a social welfare organization, cultural organization, educational organization, money has to go into it, because that has to be the at least a minimal level of commitment to the organization. And also because things cost money. If it's education, you need some resources, whether it's a computer or a book or a pen, or, you know, if things cost money and we need to pay for them. So that needs to be a prerequisite and understood. I just don't think we need to focus on developing the people within the organization to improve their lot, because one of the best attractants, I think, because if you look at those photos that we put up of the UNIA members, what are the things you notice? How smartly they were dressed, how impeccably they were. And that in itself was an attractant to other people. When you see these Africans in the United States in that time, and you see how impeccably they turned out, they look like they're part of something significant. And I think that's one of the things that Marcus Mosiah Garvey understood, was that the presentation reflects the ambition and the vision of the organization. So both the external presentation, but also helping people deal with their day-to-day problems, I think becomes almost your informal selling card, because I think people are attracted to success and things which they perceive to be successful. That's why, you know, you find children, you know, I don't know, in Bournemouth who wear Man United shirts and not Bournemouth shirts, because people are attracted to things that they see and they think are successful. So if an organization, its members reflect the ethos of that organization, and people see they seem to be doing well, you know, both in terms of their outlook, their disposition seem to be positive, and also seem to be flourishing, that will attract people. That will attract like bees to, you know, to the pollen. So I think you're right that we need to focus on building the capacity within the organization, the financial well-being, the sort of psychological well-being of the members, and then the numbers will come. But also we need to recognize we need to deal with those belly politics issues for people, that if we don't address the day-to-day issues of people, then they're really going to see it as just a kind of pastime, a hobby, and not something that's actually about addressing real issues.
Most definitely, brother Ifayomi. We're gonna close it off there. No doubt, this is a subject that you know, can be infinite, and we look forward to the book, brother Ifayomi. You know what I'm saying? We can talk. I don't know if you're self-publishing, but I may have some avenues for publishing for you if you ever do write the book. So we give thanks, you know, or let's say at least production. Let's say that. You know what I'm saying? If you ever do write the book, so we give thanks. I'm sure ones have got a lot from that. So do join us, kings and queens. Well, first of all, you can watch the playback. So I know a number of you came in late, but you can watch from the beginning once we're done. And next week, we have, firstly, kicking off on Monday, the 10th of Mosiah. Call it Chagulia Day, the 10th of Mosiah. We don't call it August Kings and Queens. This is the month of Mosiah. Yeah. From 8 p.m., Africa Speaks with Alkebu-Lan on Galaxy Radio. We are featuring our brother Tristan Samuels, who is a doctoral student in Africology at Temple University in the United States in Philadelphia. And we're going to be exploring what is the role of scholarship in African liberation. What is the role of scholarship in African liberation? So check that out. Their website is galaxyafiwi.com. And next week, Ujima Day, Tuesday, the 11th of Mosiah, we're going to be back here again on Alkebu-Lan Way with our live online Mosiah session entitled Feminism versus African Nationalist Womanhood. And our speakers on that day will be Professor Mambo Ama Mazama, Professor of Africology and African American Studies Department at Temple University. She is also the per arts, or the head of the organization Afrocentricity International. And we also will be joined by our senior pioneer, Sister Kaya Awagadao Bandaka, who is leadership of the Alkebu-Lan revivalist movement for that subject. Once again, next week, feminism versus African nationalist womanhood. If you want more information on the entire Mosiah program, feel free to visit us at alkebu-lan.org, as you see on your screens, alkebu-lan.org. And if you want to go straight to the page, it's alkebu-lan.org/Mosiah, Mosiah. The following week, we are going to be joined by Brother Abiola So of Nation Kamit over there in France, kings and queens. Yes, indeed, in France. And I'm saying this now because his topic relates to some of what we were talking about today in terms of agriculture and free market and textiles and them kind of things there. The subject is the war against neo-colonialism. The war against neo-colonialism. Those of you who are connected to Shakara Speaks know that Brother Abiola delivered a version of the presentation that he's going to deliver on the, let me get the date right, the 18th of Mosiah, and it's absolutely brilliant, kings and queens here, the work that the brother has put together. So I encourage you to join us on Ojimade Tuesday, the 18th of Mosiah, for the war against neo-colonialism. We're going to give thanks to Brother Ifayomi for joining us this evening. We're going to give thanks to the entire Alkebu-Lan leadership for this institution called Mosiah. You've prompted me, Brother Ifayomi. Can you please share with the listeners, the viewers, how they can keep in touch with you and your works?
Yeah, I just my email address is probably the best way. One, I produce a newsletter called The Navigator. So if people want to subscribe for the newsletter, just email me at Ifayomi, which is IFAYOMI at uwclub.net. IFAYOMI at uwclub.net. They can subscribe to the newsletter, and again, if they want to email me, if they want the copy of the presentation, I can just email that to them as well if they want that. So yeah, that's where. And they can also go to houseofknowledge.org.uk, houseofknowledge.org.uk, which is the website where they can see some of my newsletter archives, also bits about the books, reviews, that kind of stuff.
Thank you very much, Brother Ifayomi Grant. Giving thanks to all the brothers and sisters who have locked in, silent listeners, vocal listeners, and those who just type. We give thanks to you all, and we encourage you to join us next week as Mosiah continues. Oh, one more thing I should announce, actually. This coming weekend, kings and queens, as I announced at the beginning of the session, this is the 100th year since the International Convention of the African People of the World, as held in 1920 in New York, kings and queens. And so this year, the RBG Centennial, the Red, Black, Green Centennial, is taking place this weekend, the 8th and the 9th of Mosiah. And we've got over 50 organizations, over 70 speakers over that weekend, kings and queens. You don't want to miss the monumental event that this is going to be. Brother leader Bandaka, the spiritual leader of the Alkebu-Lan revivalist movement, will be taking part in the first plenary session on day one, which is Imani Day, Saturday, the 8th of August, alongside Mambo Ama Mazama, and it will be entitled Strategies for Nation Building. I am speaking in workshops, breakout sessions on both days, but some of the subjects that are being dealt with are strategies for defending the nation, African-centered education, the role of science, as we was alluded to earlier, in forwarding an African nation-building agenda, articles for self-determination. There's going to be an award ceremony for the Sublime Order of the Now, strategies for African victory, strategies for teaching the nation, and so on and so forth, kings and queens. Yeah, economic strategies for developing the nation. Yeah, and so it's going to be a beautiful 2 days of African self-determination and nation-building efforts. So we encourage you. Oh, Mambo Ama will be joining us. Queen Mother Mashariki Jaiwanza, Baba Mwalimu Buruti, Okinini Obadele Kambon, Sesh Molefiketi Asante, and others, kings and queens. Yeah, Brother Asa Imhotep, Brother Omawale Africa, Sister Tierney, Cherie, enough people, kings and queens, are going to be on that particular bill. So do join us here. For tickets and all information, rbgcentennial.com. Centennial is spelled CENTENNIAL, CENTENNIAL.com. TENNIAL.com. Okay, and we look forward to seeing you this weekend for the RBG Centennial Conference. Join us next week for Mosiah session number 2, entitled Feminism versus African Nationalist Womanhood. Until such time, kings and queens, enjoy Mosiah. Garvey lives. Mosiah lives. Tendamwari.
Tendamwari.